listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition and another week of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from across our disunited country and the surface of our increasingly divided globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. You had a great weekend. I want to give folks a quick rundown of today's show. At 7:30 a.m. Eastern this morning, we're planning on speaking with Brian McDonald. He's the head of the Russia desk at RT Online. We're going to be talking about the European Union alleging Russian disinfo on Sputnik V, specifically saying that the Russian government has charged the West, the United States, the European Union, with putting out bad press, specifically to tarnish the reputation of the Sputnik V vaccine. We will be getting into whether that actually is disinfo or whether we've seen a spate of news articles pretty much unanimously critical of Sputnik V. Anyway, we're also going to be talking about the Odessa massacre, which had its anniversary, its 7-year anniversary this weekend. This was a massacre, series of mass killings, a mass killing, really, back in May of 2014 during the Euromaidan, the Ukrainian Revolution. We're going to be going into that as, of course, the war in the east of the country, on the borders of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, still rages. We're also going to be talking about whether or not Alexei Navalny's orgs qualify as extremist political organizations. Again, that's at 7:30 with Brian McDonald. From 8:15 to 8:45, we're planning on speaking with Peter Oliver, talking about the German High Court releasing a ruling last week, which would basically try to set the, change the trajectory of the country so that Germany produced no net carbon emissions by the year 2050. It got to net zero, basically. We're also planning on talking about Germany without Merkel and what has led to the defense of Nord Stream 2 among the German political class, what's led to the offense against it, basically looking at what will happen when Chancellor Angela Merkel is out of her office, and depending on who replaces her, what we might see then. At 8:45, we're planning on speaking with Hari Nasrallah about the lack of COVID supplies in northeast Syria. This is a story that came out late last week, talking about how specifically in Kurdish regions, they lack COVID supplies. We're going to be getting into exactly what's going on there, why we're not hearing about the Syrian government's shortage of vaccines, why it's prioritizing the Kurds, what might be causing that, and more. Then at 9:15, much later on in the show, we're planning on speaking with Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author, about regime change in China, attempts to potentially get Xi Jinping out of the office and somebody more conciliatory to Western interests, the United States interests specifically, into the office there. Whether that push could succeed, what it looks like, how you can see it as an extension of the same damn U.S. policy. This is spurred by a news article we'll be getting into. We're also planning on talking about some comments made by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin a few months ago, and how that might set the tenor. He's basically saying that the U.S., if deterrence doesn't work, the U.S., quote, must be prepared to fight and win, end quote. And Jamarl, I believe that you had a sort of philosophical look at this that you wanted to get into. Is that actually the necessity, or can we engage in sort of mutually productive relations? What does deterrence even mean? That's the question I want to get into. What are we trying to deter China from doing? There are some practical things. For instance, Taiwan, what we would call an invasion of Taiwan, that kind of thing. Hong Kong, Xinjiang certainly comes to mind. But are we also just trying to deter their growth generally? Because the answer seems to me to be yes. Anyway, we want to get into that conversation with Caleb Maupin. But without further ado, that's a brief preview of today's show. First up, in the headlines, in COVID news, there were at least 29,536 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday, with 299 new deaths. That is the lowest number of reported new cases the U.S. has seen since last September, when cases dropped that low for just a few days. And before that, it would have been early June of 2020, almost a full year ago at this point. Over the past week, there has been an average of 49,266 cases per day. That's a decrease of 27% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 32% of the American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, and 44% of residents have received at least one dose. We're inching closer to the one-third, fully vaccinated mark and the 50%, the halfway mark, when it comes to how many residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,448,723 people across the United States, and it has killed about 574,790 people in the U.S. Over in the UK, the United Kingdom's Health Secretary Dominic Raab has said that even as the country passes a total of 15 million people fully vaccinated, masks and social distancing policies could remain in place until after the government's Roadmap to Freedom plan ends in mid-June. That's in about a month and a half. Upwards of 41 million vaccines have been distributed in England so far. That's enough to at least partially vaccinate almost 3/4 of the British public. Health service officials are also reportedly considering whether or not to give a single dose of the Pfizer vaccine to children ages 12 and up as they re-enter school. The UK government is also facing calls to cancel the importation of 15 million vaccines from India. That, of course, comes as India faces the steepest part of its second wave yet. It just keeps getting worse as far as we can tell. Daily cases rose to over 400,000 this weekend in India on Saturday. This comes as the head of the world's largest vaccine manufacturer, the Serum Institute of India, has blamed Narendra Modi's government for its failure to procure vaccines for domestic use, waiting until late February to order 21 million doses. That's February of this year, of course, before ordering 110 million doses in March. Now, that might sound like a lot, but that came well into the current second wave in India, and that is not enough to vaccinate even 10% of the Indian public. The son of the CEO of the Serum Institute has described being threatened by tycoons in the country to attempt to extract use. Vaccine shortages in the country are likely to last until at least July. Back to Europe. In France, children are now allowed to return to school as the coronavirus pandemic appears to be abating, at least temporarily there. People are now also being allowed to travel more than 10 kilometers from their homes. Yes, you heard that right. We were talking about this on the show a while back. For a time there, the French public prohibited in some cases from traveling more than 10 kilometers from their homes. Jamarl, I think if I remember correctly, our take on this at the time was if your government is telling you that you can't travel more than 10 kilometers from your homes, there's something wrong there. Now, admittedly, the pandemic is one wrong thing, right? In the middle of one still. But that's a pretty heavy-handed order for a large bulk of the population. What's your take?
Yeah, that's pretty intense. I mean, how do you even determine whether somebody is 10 kilometers away from their house? I mean, are the cops just stopping everybody that's out in order to validate that? That's a pretty intense order. I mean, look, if your country is in, let's say if your country is in a war, then they may give some pretty extreme orders in regards to, trying to propagate that war, trying to win that war. So they may say no lights on, none, zero. And if there are lights on, you can be shot on sight because those lights can bring on a bombing raid, et cetera, et cetera. But does COVID count for that? I don't know. That seems extreme.
It does seem extreme. It does seem extreme, and that's why I wouldn't downplay the concerns about some of these. I think that more people than ever is the thing. More people than ever are frustrated by government overreaches of power. Whether this is one is still a matter of debate, but it's pretty gosh darn extreme. And a couple different sides of this. So this is an extreme extension of government authorities. At the same time, a lot of people are pushing back against it. At the same time, a lot of people who are pushing back against it are also doing so, as far as I can tell, using certain types of misinformation, either completely downplaying. Empathize with and see as a valid response. To a valid response to genuine government overreach. Anyway, we can get back to the news. This all comes as the European Commission has recommended that citizens outside the bloc who have been fully vaccinated should be allowed to travel to Europe without additional restrictions. They're also calling for restrictions to be eased in relation to countries with lower than average circulation of the coronavirus. In national political news, back here in the States, Andrew Brown Jr. will be laid to rest today as his family continues to demand the release of the body cam footage from his police killing in its entirety. It's reported that members of the families of George Floyd and Eric Garner will be attending his burial. Protests continued throughout the weekend in Elizabeth City, that's in South Carolina, where he was killed. Off the coast of San Diego, a boat capsized this weekend, killing 4 and injuring 24 who were on board. Authorities inspecting the incident say it seems to have been a human smuggling operation. In international news, Taiwan has told staffing companies to ban all hiring from China, reportedly in an aim to reduce tech poaching of Taiwanese employees involved in the production of integrated circuits and semiconductors. Basically, if you live in Taiwan, they don't want you to go and work in China, effectively, because if you know some of the details of how they produce integrated circuits, semiconductors specifically, they don't want you to go and take those, what they would view as almost, approaching the level of a state secret practically in terms of its economic importance to Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the world's largest semiconductor manufacturers. That seems to be like the staple of their economy practically at this point. At least it would be good to get somebody on to talk to us at some point, about exactly what how their economy works. And I know, Jamarl, we've actually had a conversation. There's like a worldwide semiconductor shortage. And if you're in the market, either for cryptocurrency mining or for gaming, if you want a GPU, basically a graphics processing unit, which is a unit dedicated to doing certain kinds of math, it's very useful for math and for crypto mining. Basically, the prices for those are through the roof right now. I'm not in the market. I play games sometimes, but I'm not, I already have a computer that I'm pretty satisfied with. But if you're not, you'll notice that the prices for trying to get one of them right now are crazy. I was talking to my brother who was recently looking into this stuff, and it's like products that were released 3 or 4 years ago. And there's every year, there are new generations of cards coming out. Products that were released 3 or 4 years ago are selling at MSRP when they were released at the time. In other words, there's a huge sort of freeze on prices. Prices are crazy high for current generation chips. And this is affecting the world as far as we can tell. Now, this is partly driven by an increase in cryptocurrency mining, but it also seems to largely be driven by long-term slowdowns spurred by the coronavirus, by basically supply line cutdowns, and it is affecting worldwide semiconductor production anyway. What that means, of course, is that prices for semiconductors have risen tremendously, and so Taiwan is wanting to make sure that they don't lose any of their bleeding edge in that tech, so they're keeping their employees from being hired in China. There you go. Syria's current president, Bashar al-Assad, has been approved as one of 3 candidates to run for president in the country of Syria. In Saudi Arabia, the king of Saudi Arabia named a new economic minister, Faisal al-Ibrahim, and made his eldest son, Prince Sultan bin Salman, a special advisor. That would be replacing his role as the head of the Saudi Space Authority. In Germany, police have shut down one of the world's largest networks for sharing images of child abuse on the darknet. They arrested approximately 4 men in the process, one of whom I believe was living in Paraguay. The network had around 400,000 members. And in tech news, China has successfully launched the first module of its new space station. This is a sort of informal competitor to the International Space Station. It is a Chinese one. And this also comes as, and I believe it's 2025, we're going to be seeing Russia pulling out of the ISS and also launching its own space station. So you're going to have a sort of trifecta now of manned, in operation space stations floating above our Earth in orbit. There's some good sides of this. There are some bad sides of this. In some sense, the space race ended in the favor of the United States when we landed men on the moon. And arguably what we've seen since then was a significant slowdown in investment in space. This has been accelerating recently, of course, with Elon Musk deciding to get involved, and just in general, with a sort of return of the public's attention and decisions to invest in space exploration and in manned space missions and in unmanned space missions, of course. Anyway, I'm a little bit optimistic that we're going to see something similar here, as you now have sort of separate approaches, Russia, China, and members of the international community, each getting involved in their own ways in building space stations. Hopefully it doesn't get destructive. That would, of course, be the sort of pessimistic part is hopefully all of the investment in these technologies doesn't lead to some new sort of military technology and a new military competition that could be catastrophic for the terrestrial members of our race. Anyway, we need to go into a break. Those were our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute in our soapbox segment with Jamarl's monologue. Be right back.
Fault lines. What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So I have to say that the last headline that you gave, I don't think is a good one. I like this idea of us as a planet going into space as one world. I don't like this idea of us breaking ourselves into these groups. You know, what does it look like? China takes one patch of the moon, the US takes another patch of the moon, Russia takes another patch of the moon. It feels weirdly ridiculous to me. And so it's kind of this thing of like, yeah, I like this hopeful thing of Earth, regardless of the issues that we have. It's kind of like, from the standpoint of a country, they used to say that the issues of a country only go up to the border of the country, at which point all of the politicians, regardless of how vitriolic they may be in-house, even kill when we get outside. It's, you know, we keep our issues in-house. Well, what does it look like when we're leaving the planet itself? Shouldn't it also be somewhat of the same idea? And so, yeah, I don't think that's a hopeful note that both of us, that we're breaking ourselves into groups like this. But nevertheless, let's go to the main story. Identity politics. Now, I made the point that Rick Scott giving that ad or giving that rebuttal was one of the most racist things that has happened this year. I mean, basically, he's using his black face and black body, the only black Republican, to stand there and cover for a lot of things that are going to adversely affect that same group. And he's doing this, projecting to that group, directed at that group, in a conversation that honestly was about economics. Fact of the matter is, Scott and his entire persona was there for that explicit point of blocking for the Republican Party. Either he was a useful idiot or he was a willing participant. Both of those cases are problematic for me. By the same token, he's not the only one that does this. You find now that the shiny object politics that takes place where instead of real policy, real things that would, in physical matter reality way, benefit a particular group, has been replaced by, look at me, I'm black. Look at me, I'm a woman. Look at me, I'm a hermaphrodite. It seems that the identity thing has basically subsumed everything else, and has even gotten to the point where other groups have started using identity in order to sell itself to the masses. Groups like the CIA. Yes, the CIA has now donned the cloak of identity and has used that in its recruitment. Let's play the clip. I found this weirdly disturbing. Let's play this clip.
When I was 17, I quoted Zora Neale Hurston's How It Feels to Be Colored Me in my college application essay. The line that spoke to me stated simply, I am not tragically colored. There is no sorrow dammed up in my soul nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. At 17, I had no idea what life would bring, but Zora's sentiment articulated so beautifully how I felt as a daughter of immigrants then and now. Nothing about me was or is tragic. I am perfectly made. I can wax eloquent on complex legal issues in English while also belting Guayaquil de mis amores in Spanish. I can change a diaper with one hand and console a crying toddler with the other. I am a woman of color. I am a mom. I am a cisgender millennial who's been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. I am intersectional, but my existence is not a box-checking exercise. I am a walking declaration, a woman whose inflection does not rise at the end of her sentences, suggesting that a question has been asked. I did not sneak into CIA. My employment was not and is not the result of a fluke or slip through the cracks. I earned my way in, and I earned my way up the ranks of this organization. I am educated, qualified, and competent, and sometimes I struggle. I struggle feeling like I could do more, be more to my two sons, and I struggle leaving the office when I feel there's so much more to do. I used to struggle with imposter syndrome, but at 36, I refuse to internalize misguided patriarchal ideas of what a woman can or should be. I am tired of feeling like I'm supposed to apologize for the space I occupy rather than intoxicate people with my effort, my brilliance. I am proud of me, full stop. My parents left everything they knew and loved to expose me to opportunities they never had. Because of them, I stand here today a proud first-generation Latina and officer at CIA. I am unapologetically me. I want you to be unapologetically you, whoever you are. Know your worth, command your space.
Know your worth, command your space. Worth, so subjective, so philosophical. That's rough, that's hard, man, that's a hard one. I guess the point that I want to make here, I am a cisgender millennial with generalized anxiety disorder. What the hell is that? Generalized anxiety, just in general, I have anxiety. And I don't want to rag on that too much, but we are talking about somebody who's apparently joining the CIA. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a positive attribute to be in the CIA. And all of this, I mean, the entire ad there was just, look at my identity! Look at my identity! Look at my identity! Worship my identity! And all in the service of what Mike Pompeo said was lie, cheat, steal for a living. What does your race or your sex or your the whole cisgender millennial stuff have to do with the job that you're going to do at the CIA? Are there not black, Asian women, men, etc. at the CIA? And there's something weird, oddly weird. I get politicians do this, where politicians are in a position where they're like, all right, people have expectations of me. Yes. And I'm a Democrat. Oh, yes. All right. I have two options. I can either use identity and say, hey, look at me, I'm black, or I'm a woman, vote me in office, or I can try to represent those people's interests in real terms. So instead of, hey, here's Kamala Harris, a black woman, it would be, here's Medicare for all. By the way, putting Kamala Harris in that position doesn't preclude you from putting Medicare for all. I'm just making the point that if it's an either or, I would take the Medicare for all. That one is directly beneficial to the various individuals, and that goes beyond a person just screaming, hey, look at my identity, or whatever that is. Don't misunderstand me. I understand how in a particular position, a person not being there or not being represented by a particular color or sex or so forth, especially over the course of time, makes it look as if that person is barred out of that position. And the very act of being in that position with a particular color or gender or whatever that particular identity role is gives other people the idea that that position can be attained. The thing is, the moment that you hit a black president, the other stuff seems lesser. And not just lesser. In this very specific instance, something feels weird to me by using and hitting identity on this level. I mean, for God's sake, it's a 2-minute video of her triumphizing, if that's I may be butchering that word, but you know what I'm trying to get at, specifics of identity. And I have zero idea what any of that have to do with the job at the CIA. Zero. Shane, help me out. What does any of those attributes, her cisgender millennial, generalized anxiety disorder,
that one.
She could change. Yeah, I love that one. That one. I don't mean to laugh.
That's the one that fit. That's the one that fits for me. That's the if I had to think of an initial psychiatric condition that the CIA as a general suffers from, I would start with generalized anxiety disorder, and then you could get to like narcissistic personality disorder. You could get to all these different DSM-5 sort of classifications. But yeah, generalized anxiety disorder, that does sound like the CIA to me. They sound pretty anxious. She sounds really defensive. Is the
weird? She does. I mean, weirdly.
She doesn't. She doesn't actually. She doesn't sound sort of triumphant. And I think triumphalizing works, but I don't think that's technically a word. But I
don't think that's a word.
I don't know what the word for that exactly is, but no. But she doesn't actually sound triumphant. She sounds defensive. She sounds like a little bit defensive and paranoid, and like, don't question me. Don't question my identity.
Yeah. And she was like, I will not be up the the end of my sentence. I will not be doing that.
And like, me personally, speaking as a white cisgender millennial male, maybe I shouldn't be too critical of her defensive-ness because I can't inhabit her intersectional shoes. But the weirdest thing here, of course, is not that she's saying this stuff. This could be like a random TikTok off the internet, whatever. This could be somebody on Tumblr or Twitter, grievance posting, something like that. It's that it's a CIA advertisement. It is apparently a CIA. I was planning on playing this too, and I'm glad you got to this one. So I was talking with Andre this morning. I was trying to get this clip up. You got it. You played it in full. I was only going to play a part of it. It's just weird to me that this is the approach that the CIA is taking in terms of who they're hiring. And I guess I'm glad to see them jumping the shark. I guess I'm glad to see this instead of something that would actually work or like appeal to competent people to come in and join the ranks of the CIA. This just seems like it's going to attract the most neurotic, introvertedly critical people of all. I don't know, and I'm saying that as a critical introverted person. But anyway, a bunch of different commentary there. But no, this is ridiculous. This is obscene. It's insane, and it shows not only the CIA's attempt to poach the ideology of the left, which, as far as I can tell, in some sense, they probably helped to create. But where does this leave the left? Where does this leave the new left, the new left, the neo left, whatever you want to call it? Where does this leave the like non-economically based, more identity-based left? Are they going to become intel community hawks? It seems like that's what we're headed towards on this side of Russiagate. You know what I mean? And that's, I guess, what I'm actually a little bit concerned about, that the focus on humanitarian interventionism, the focus on protecting human rights everywhere, that kind of thing, which is so often used to justify more wars, that there's just going to be a complete intersection, see what I did there, between the CIA, the neo-left, whatever you want to call it, and I'm worried about where that would take our country. But the thing is, they seem like they're setting themselves up to be so radically incompetent that maybe I shouldn't be concerned. But
I don't know, man.
Before we close, what's your take, man?
Yeah, I don't know. I understand that, if you're back in the 60s and you get a person of color getting into a position, fair enough. I understand that, women trying to get into various positions, same thing, where Nixon, there's the tapes where Nixon puts a woman up for a position that he knows she's not going to get. And he does so just so he can get the credit of being a progressive president by pushing the envelope while also setting women back 10 years. At least that's what it's thought. So I get that that stuff takes place. But at a certain point, there is this idea or there's this thought that perhaps you've gone too far. And perhaps at a certain point, it's become theatrical. And that it's being used not in a way that it was originally intended to kind of open doors, but more so in a way to manipulate. And that's where we are. And whether that's being used in political spaces where people would say, you know, I'm the black candidate, or I'm the woman candidate, or I'm the Latino candidate. Well, now it's being used in the recruitment space for the CIA. And yeah, I'm glad you said it that way. Leftist language, being a woke leftist language, now being used by the CIA in recruitment. It can be a black hand on the gun or a woman's finger on the trigger, and that somehow makes it better. It doesn't. That's the problem. It doesn't. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So I want to start here. Let's start making note of the massacre that took place yesterday, back in 2014. This is the 7th anniversary of the trade union's house fire. 48 people were killed, 6 people in the street, and a further 42 died in a fire that started by far-right Ukrainian nationalists. To give us more information about this, but also we're going to have a conversation about the EU attacking Russia on a very weird point to attack Russia on, having to do with pushing the Sputnik vaccine and basically saying that Russia is pushing their vaccine, but saying that other groups are trying to denigrate their vaccine. And I'm making the point that says this is weird that they're attacking them on it because it is flat fact reality true. Flat fact reality true. We're going to have a conversation about that. Joining us is head of the Russia desk at RT Online, Brian McDonald. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Hey, good morning to you.
Absolutely. So the Odessa massacre, can you give us a little bit of background? I'm not necessarily going to delve too far into it, but I did want to reference it. Just, again, it was something that was significant that took place. Just for the audience that may not be aware of it or know about it.
The Odessa massacre was in 2014. It was on the 2nd of May, so the 7th anniversary was yesterday. And 48 people, mostly ethnic Russians, who were killed and more than 250 injured after the right sector, which is so basically the way Ukraine works is that the west of Ukraine is, I wouldn't say uniformly, but most of the Western Ukraine is ethnic Ukrainian. They're generally, many of them are Greek Catholics religiously. The center of Ukraine, then Kiev, Dnipropetrovsk, and whatever, is more mixed. Russian can tend to be the predominant language, but the ethnicity is mixed. But in the south and the east of the country, historically, they've been Russian-speaking and largely populated by ethnic Russians. Odessa, which I think is the 4th or 5th biggest city in the country, would be seen probably, other than Donetsk, probably as the most Russified city in the country, in that it was established by the Russian Empire, you know, Catherine the Great and everything. And in this city, the Maidan in 2014, the revolution or coup or whatever you want to call it, was not as popular as it was in Lviv, or, Kiev, the capital, for example. So what happened at the time was that locals who were opposed to the Maidan were staging demonstrations, and a group of neo-Nazis, predominantly from Lvov and Galicia, the west of Ukraine, arrived in town called the Pravi Sector, the right sector. And there were clashes. And what it culminated in was a situation where a number of ethnic Russians, or pro-Russians, as you want to call them, were burned alive in the trade union house in Odessa. While the story was reported in a kind of wire service way by Western media at the time, it was in no way given any sort of prominence, and certainly nothing compared to the prominence given to, say, the sniper incident in Kiev, which we still don't know 7 years later who was responsible. I mean, the Western narrative is that the Yanukovych government was behind it, but there is evidence, particularly from academic studies, to show that it actually was a false flag operation, and that it was the neo-Nazi ultra-nationalist groups involved in the incident. So basically what happened was that 48 people, almost 50 people were killed, and it is suspected that the Pravi Sector set the building on fire deliberately. But of course, Ukraine being Ukraine, no investigation has taken place, or no substantial investigation, and there is no, nobody's ever been charged for it or identified for the massacre. So what happened on Saturday was that there was a protest, there was a commemoration, which was basically, people laying flowers and stuff like that. And a bunch of neo-Nazis turned up again and marched through the streets of Odessa, chanting, Hitlerite slogans and right-wing slogans. And, obviously none of them were arrested. I don't think there was any violence from what I saw. And there was about 400 neo-Nazis involved in the march. And the lead vehicle carried a Nazi Wolfsangel flag, or Wolf's Angel in English. This is Europe in, 2021. And it's almost hard to fathom that this could be happening, but it is.
Well, that's just it. I mean, the United States, or the press here, tries to ignore the fascist angle that takes place in Ukraine. I mean, for God's sake, full-on Nazis. And I saw you're getting in a back and forth. Well, I don't know if it's a back and forth, but Sloboda making the point about, it being a fascist state. And you were saying, well, you don't necessarily know if it's a fascist state. I got to be honest, I think I agree with Sloboda on this. Just to be on, John McCain on the Washington Post, basically standing with, out and out Nazis. Not to mention some of the brigades or some of the people, the groups in the military. And if there is a deviation from the main line, let's say, for example, that the government of Ukraine says, you know what, we're going to rejoin and we're going to put this conflict aside. Would they be able to do it? And the answer is probably no.
Jamarl, I've got to say to you that Ukraine is not a fascist state. It is a state that has a problem with fascism, but it is not a fascist state in terms of ideology or in terms of what the majority of people feel. The government is not fascist. The government is guilty of turning a blind eye to fascist tendencies and neo-Nazi sympathizers, probably for fear of what they could do if they were challenged directly. But there is I want to make it clear that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is not a fascist. It is not a fascist state. Now, Sloboda can say what he wants, but I don't know when's the last time he's been in Ukraine, but it is not a fascist country. It's not a fascist country, okay? It has a problem with fascism, but it's not a fascist country.
How do you make the distinction?
Because the reason is there is a small group. We're talking probably a couple of thousand of people have I lost you? Have you got me? Yeah. Hello?
No, I'm here.
Hello, we lost the signal.
No, I'm here.
What I'm trying to say is that there is a small but very militant and very vocal group, predominantly from the west of the country, who are fascists, and they wield power in the country beyond their numbers. Disproportionate power, because authorities are afraid of them. Whether politicians are afraid of being assassinated or anarchy breaking out, there are various reasons for it. But basically, what it is. It's a bit like, in a way, I want to make an American kind of association. Maybe there's something like the Ku Klux Klan, generations ago, in a sense that most Americans, I hope, would not have supported what they were doing. But authorities in certain states turned a blind eye to their activities for reasons of fear or reasons of tacit support. I don't know. But it's just important to say that Ukraine is not a fascist state. And people that say that are effectively undermining their own argument and just propagandizing. It's not true.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, it seems, Brian, thank you for joining us. It seems if we look not too far away in Europe, it seems like Hungary and Poland specifically have recently moved to the right of where Ukraine is now. Again, this is a little bit far afield from the Odessa massacre at this point, but I agree with you. I wouldn't call Ukraine a fascist state. There are certainly fascist sympathizers in positions of power, but I'm not saying that Zelensky specifically is one of those. And that pretty much lines up with what you were saying, but I hear you on this one. I want to turn here, actually, though. I think we got into that a bit, and thank you for the good overview on the Odessa massacre. It's important to understand because that was one of the key events leading up, right up in advance of the creation of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. There was that. There were other instances of people being attacked. I don't think any quite as brutal as that one was, but there were other instances of people being attacked for pushing back.
Well, what Pravi Sektora did in Odessa, was effectively a warning shot in some ways to the locals that if they tried to do what Donetsk and Lugansk did, that this was what the nationalists were going to do. So, I mean, that they're totally connected. You're totally right. And I mean, the nationalist heavies basically were sent in from Galicia to stamp out any chance of a Donetsk or Lugansk situation happening. So you're completely connected. And Poland and Hungary in some ways are connected to this too, like you just said, because it's the impunity the West has shown towards the far right in Ukraine and the blind eye turn to it that has emboldened the Hungarians and Polish to think they can get away with it, of course.
Yes, yeah. And this was, I mean, the LPR and the DPR, they were officially founded not very shortly after this event took place, but the talks of their creation as independent states had started back in April of 2014. It had started earlier, as far as I can tell. That was the official process. So this was right during, in other words, this was during the sort of independence movement in the eastern regions of the country, showing this as a sort of shot across the bow or a warning to the Russian Ukrainians, to the ethnically Russian and culturally Russian Ukrainians. That makes perfect sense. I want to pivot here, though. I want to talk about the Sputnik V vaccine, where the EU has alleged in a lawsuit, a specific branch of the EU has alleged in a lawsuit that Russia is spreading disinformation by saying that the West, and that would include the United States and the European Union, are effectively trying to push back on it. This is a weird kind of double inverted story. It's a little bit hard to understand. So I just want to get the right takeout on the first try here. Sputnik V, of course, a Russian vaccine, the first vaccine developed and put out in a limited scale on the world stage back in August of last year. Russia has offered to give, and in some cases to sell it to countries since then, dozens of different countries. The United States specifically, we've talked about this. In the case of Brazil, they basically did what they could to keep Brazil from buying those vaccines from Russia, from buying the Sputnik V vaccine from Russia. There's a specific example of us keeping another country from getting access to the Sputnik V vaccine. As anybody who's been watching the story has noticed, there have been a spate of negative articles about the Sputnik V vaccine across the Western press. Now, that would include, outlets in the United States like the New York Times and the Washington Post, but that would also include outlets like the Guardian over in the UK and in the EU as well. And at this point, the EU is alleging that the Russian disinfo is effectively that there has been a concerted effort by the Western press to oppose the Sputnik V vaccine. That's what their lawsuit is alleging, which seems baseless to me because it seems clear to me that there has been a concerted effort. That's my take. Brian, from your side of the aisle, from living in Russia, how is this being treated locally? Is there any coverage of this lawsuit? Is there any coverage, of this claim of disinformation? And specifically, do you think it has merit? Do you see this as disinfo by the Russian government, Brian?
Well, what I will say to you is that, first of all, I wasn't aware of the lawsuit, but I will say to you that if there is Russian disinformation going on about vaccines, it is nothing compared to the disinformation that is being spread about Sputnik V in the West. I mean, I'll give you an example. A Guardian article, which was published on Friday, I think, by a guy called John Henley, who's their Europe correspondent, has no particular expertise on Russia or vaccines, as far as I know. wrote a propaganda piece for the paper, which basically the headline was, "Is Russia's COVID vaccine anything more than a political weapon?" I mean, like, how stupid is that, you know? It says, and his subheading was that the Sputnik jab is aimed more at sowing political division than fighting coronavirus. So we are to believe, The Guardian believes, that a group of Russian scientific researchers went to all the trouble of creating a coronavirus vaccine so they could sow political division in the European Union. I mean, have you ever heard of anything so preposterous in your life? And what the Western press have done, and the Guardian article is a great example, is they've gone to the think tank racket. They've gone to stuff like the Atlantic Council and the German Marshall Fund of the United States and all the usual suspects. And they've got these guys to, you know, say what they want them to say, agreeing with the narrative they're trying to spread, and basically trying to make it sound that the Russian vaccine is, you know, a geopolitical thing and doesn't work. I mean, the actual situation is, as the Hungarians themselves have shown, we just mentioned them, when you compare, based on their data, the Sputnik vaccine to the American and British vaccines, you'll find that it's comparable. I mean, like, obviously it hasn't been broken down yet, but according to The Lancet, which is a British magazine, Sputnik's efficacy rate is something like 91%, I think, and they put down the Pfizer one at 94%. I mean, like, that's margin of error stuff, which means that it's an effective vaccine. Now, whether it's safe or not, I mean, that's up in the air for all the vaccines at the moment. They're all experimental, but there's nothing at the moment to say that Sputnik is any less safe than Pfizer or Moderna, the ones that you're using in the United States. But the 100%. EU's messaging has been all over the place. I mean, they told Russia to submit an application to the EMA, which is the European Medicines Agency, to evaluate Sputnik. And then just a couple of days later, you had this guy, this EU Commission Internal Market Commissioner, Thierry Breton, who's French, I believe, and he was going on French television saying we've absolutely no need of Sputnik V.
Wow.
So, like,
wow.
why are they going to the pretense of saying to Moscow, hey, send your vaccine in for evaluation, and then the guy who runs their trade internal markets goes on TV a couple of days later and says we don't need it. We've absolutely no need for it.
It's weird miscommunication. And I briefly, before we get any further, I want to correct myself here. I was saying lawsuit. I meant report. Yeah. I want to correct myself, especially because, that is my mistake. It is a report. This is from the EEAS, the chief foreign policy agency of the EU, as far as I can tell, that released a special report basically alleging that there was Russian disinfo on this. My mistake, and I want to correct that. But it's weirdly mismatched, as we've spoken about with another guest of ours. The EU as a bloc is not, they're not pursuing Sputnik V contracts, but individual member countries are. They're in talks with Russia. These are ongoing talks. Individual countries have already, drawn up those contracts and started to procure them in some cases. They've some countries have gotten pushback for this, including in Slovakia, where the head of state there effectively had to step down, if I'm not misremembering, over a contract with Russia. Wow. On the Sputnik V vaccine. But different member states are pursuing it, each in their own way. So it's weird, like you say, for Thierry Breton, the European Commissioner for Internal Market for the EU, to come out and say there isn't a need. As the EU, I guess second only or third to India and Brazil in the world, the EU as a bloc right now is seriously struggling, not with the coronavirus in general, but with its vaccine procurement policies. Long, drawn-out conflicts with the UK over AstraZeneca. And like you're saying, the Sputnik V vaccine, even though it is not an mRNA-based vaccine like Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, it is still up at that level of quality. And so far, it doesn't seem to have, maybe we'll see it come out, doesn't seem to have the potential sort of rare blood clotting condition associated with it that the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson shots do. We need to go into a break. We are joined by Brian McDonald. Brian is the head of the Russia desk at RT Online. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Brian McDonald, head of the Russia desk at RT Online. You can follow Brian, by the way, on Twitter at 27KHV. That's 27KHV on Twitter. Brian, thank you again for being with us. I want to move quickly to Alexei Navalny and his organizations, which have shut down and are under, effectively a lot of scrutiny right now. They're potentially going to be labeled as extremist orgs, which would put them permanently out of operations. I'll get immediately to the point. Briefly, Brian, who is Alexei Navalny? And do the organizations that he started, this network of organizations under his anti-corruption foundation, are they extremist, bluntly, Brian?
Well, it depends on how you judge extremist. I mean, under Russian law, the criteria at which they're being classed as extremist is that they're essentially accused of being agents of the West with a mission to destabilize Russia from within. Now, I'm a journalist, not an activist, and I'm also not a lawyer. So it's not for me to tell you whether I think they're extremists or not. Personally, I'm not sure I would agree. But they, under Russian law, as it is being applied at the moment, they're being viewed as extremists, as I said, because they are seen as tools of Western influence effectively set up to create the scenario or the circumstances for a color revolution in Russia. And that is how they are viewed.
And that seems accurate. As we've covered before, with the meeting between the the MI6 agent and Vladimir Asherkov, or Vadim Asherkov.
Which was a decade ago.
Yeah. Which was a decade ago. I mean, I know you need to go. Does, in your mind, that distance, that move from Navalny at this point, or does that show that it was set up at an earlier date, that there were attempts to procure funding from the West at that early date?
It's only a taster. I mean, obviously, when Navalny was in Germany, I mean, obviously he was, involved with the Bellingcat group and stuff like that, which is obviously funded by Western governments, making those videos and everything. Funded by the US and British governments, and obviously, I mean, his team, it's pretty obvious, are in communication with Western groups all the time. I mean, it's pretty obvious. But the question, I suppose, you have to ask yourself from the point of view. I mean, in Russia in the 1990s, I mean, the country was effectively being run by Westerners. I mean, under Boris Yeltsin. I mean, there has been a tendency since the end of the Soviet Union for, the Russian liberal opposition to work together with Western interests, to meet with Westerners. It's only now in the last couple of years that it's become a sort of, a thing that's been clamped down upon. So, I mean, you could say the rules have changed. Now, the point is that the move that the Kremlin or the authorities have brought in has basically made it impossible for Navalny's group to operate. What's going to happen next is hard to know. But what might actually happen, if there's a silver lining for the opposition in this, is that one of the problems with the Navalny movement is that it was based around one particular person, which, in a way, you're kind of like, a liberal group complaining about authoritarianism while basing their own movement around one kind of pretty authoritarian figure as well, if you know what I mean. So what might happen now is that because the liberal opposition or the Western-leaning opposition will fragment, it could become less about the personality of Navalny and more about sort of, creating a genuine movement with genuine policies. And that could be a silver lining if there is one for them. But I mean, the era of, the personality driven thing around Navalny appears to be over now.
Well, this is a dude with a serious, I know you need to go, so we're going to let you go. This is a dude with a serious problematic recent history of statements. Where we've talked before about the ad in which he likened Muslim immigrants to the country as cockroaches and talked about exterminating them and clearing them out of the country.
That was 15 years ago, but 13, 14 years ago, yeah.
No, exactly. That was a while ago, and
I think what you need to understand about
Navalny
is that Navalny, something you need to understand is it's very easy and very lazy for people who take a pro-Putin position, for example, to say, oh, he's a fascist, or oh, he hates Muslims, or that. What Navalny is really, he's a political opportunist. I mean, in some ways, there are similarities between Navalny and Donald Trump, to be honest with you, in the sense that, you know, Trump attached himself to the Tea Party. Trump is effectively a New York liberal, yeah? And he attached himself to the Tea Party because he saw it as a way to kind of get into power. And Navalny's a bit like that as well. I mean, he started out with a liberal party called Yabloko. They expelled him. Then he started flirting with the far right towards the end of the 2010 decade. You know, he attended a few far right marches. He said the comments about Muslims. Then what he's done in the last few years is rebranded himself as a sort of pro-Western liberal. So what he is basically is a political chameleon, an opportunist. He doesn't really have any ideology or policies. He just rides the wave, you know, that he feels will best suit his objectives at one particular time. And I think that's something that a lot of analysis of Navalny, particularly, you know, from people who are sympathetic to Russia, misses the point that he's more of a populist. He's more in the mold of, you know, Marine Le Pen or Viktor Orban or Donald Trump. He's not Adolf Hitler. I mean, he's not a fascist. You know what I mean?
Very, very interesting. Brian, I know you need to go. I want to thank you for joining us. Brian McDonald, head of the Russia desk at RT Online. You can follow Brian on Twitter at 27KHV, 27KHV. Thank you for joining us, Brian. Great conversation.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Great guys. Thank you.
Have a good one. And that was, again, Brian McDonald. Again, interesting to talk to him. This is only the second time we've had him on. Good conversations each time. First time he brought us an interesting perspective. We got into propaganda and the role of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Ukraine and the sort of de-Russification or Ukrainianization of Ukraine. It doesn't sound so bad on the one hand, but basically you're subtly changing the spellings and pronunciations of people's names and the names of places, just changing the spelling and pronunciation in order to shift the country in a certain direction, to make it more Ukrainian and to, you know, sort of decrease and delegitimize any perceived links between the country and Russia. Interesting move, you know, an interesting conversation to have. And with this one, giving us a sort of more neutral, moderated perspective on Alexei Navalny. Just you know, very, very interesting stuff.
If it was, I mean, it's clear, it seems, that Navalny is connected to the West. That just seemed patently clear to me. I mean, maybe not to the degree of a Juan Guaido, but certainly in regards to the connections that are trying to be made. The organizations, whether they're extremists or not, it does seem like the objective of the organization is to take power, and to take power in a way where you're basically trying to destabilize the government to do so. And so if that was taking place in the United States, what would the United States do? I mean, I don't think it's like, I don't think it's mind-blowing, because the argument, if it's political, right? It's like, okay, we're going to say we have an anti-corruption organization. Well, is it the Department of War or is it the Department of Defense? Which one is it, right? And is it really the same thing? It just seems like a body, an organization that is used to try to undermine the government to which they're in. It would be no different than like the NGOs in various countries. Let's say like the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, putting money into various organizations to destabilize the government that it doesn't particularly like. It just seems this is just, they're doing it internally. So, you know, that's the way I see it. I mean, but he may have a different point of view of it.
No, I mean, that sounds decently similar. One quick note on Alexei Navalny, just the connection between him and Bill Browder. Again, this is coming from an outsider, and I want to get somebody to sort of back this up and go into it a little bit more. Bill Browder came to prominence and made a lot of money in Russia by doing these anti-corruption briefings, where he would sort of investigate different companies and how they were guilty of, you know, fiddling with digits and effectively engaging in corrupt behavior. He would then drive down the values of those companies, buy up their shares, and on that wave, make a lot of money as their values came back up. It seems like Navalny did something in a weird way that's parallel, where he started out as a blogger, an anti-corruption blogger, who would come in and ride a political wave by criticizing these companies. I don't want to be too critical. We need to close this hour out. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last 2 hours of this morning show.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe, welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your indefatigable, your ever vigilant, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 29,536 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with 299 deaths. That's the lowest number of reported new cases the United States has seen since last September, when cases dropped that low for just a few days. And before that, it would have been June 2020, almost a full year ago. Over the past week, there's been an average of 49,266 cases per day, a decrease of 27% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 32% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, right here, and 44% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,448,723 people across the United States and killed about 574,791 people. That is an unlucky one. Very specific number. My wife got the jab yesterday. She's not feeling good this morning. She's been having neck pains and everything else. She's as a temperamental physiology, as I would call it. And so who knows? But hopefully it's not going to be too bad.
I hope she gets better. I hope she gets better. My brother had the same thing. I didn't suffer at all, and then my brother had the same problems. Older family of mine who have gotten the second shot seem to be doing universally well.
Yeah, I have no issue. It was like I never had it. Like my arm was sore for like a day. That was it, and it was like a mild numbness of sorts. But no, she said just her neck, arm hurts. So hopefully it's not too bad. But let's keep going. The United Kingdom's Health Secretary, Dominic Raab, has said even as the country passes a total of 15 million fully vaccinated, mask and social distancing policies could remain in place until the government's, quote, roadmap to freedom, unquote. I'm sorry, I need to say that with the inflection it deserves. Roadmap to freedom plan ends in mid-June in about a month and a half. Upwards of 41 million vaccines have been distributed in England so far, enough to at least partially vaccinate almost 3/4 of the British population. Health service officials are also reportedly considering whether or not to give a single dose of the Pfizer vaccine to children ages 12 and up as they enter the school. The UK government is also facing calls to cancel the importation of 5 million vaccines from India. Wow, India is, I can't believe they're doing that. Like, I mean, not the UK, just India, that they're still importing vaccines. How are you doing that? Like, you tell me, Shane, if you were a head of a government and you were in a severe, let's say, health crisis, and you had contracts for vaccines that are supposed to be leaving your country, do you, A, keep the vaccines there by changing whatever law you need to change or mandate whatever you need to do, but sending the vaccines outside of the country at this point seems to be bad? I mean, yeah. For the condition that India is in, it just seems like that's a horrible thing. And speaking of India, daily cases rose to over 400,000 this weekend in India. This comes as ahead of the world's largest vaccine manufacturer. The Serum Institute of India has blamed Narendra Modi's government for its failure to procure vaccines for its domestic use, waiting until late February to order 21 million doses before ordering 110 million doses in March, well into the current second wave in India, and not enough to vaccinate 10% of the Indian public. The son of the CEO of Serum Institute has described being threatened by tycoons in the country to attempt to extract vaccines for their personal use. Vaccine shortages in the country are likely to last until at least July. French children are now allowed to return to school, with people now being allowed to travel more than 10 kilometers from their homes. Wow, 10 kilometers. The European Commission has recommended that citizens outside the bloc who have been fully vaccinated should be allowed to travel to Europe without additional restrictions, also calling for restrictions to be eased in relation to countries with lower than average circulation of the coronavirus. Andrew Brown Jr. will be laid to rest as his family continues to demand the release of the body cam footage from the police killing in its entirety. Members of the families of George Floyd and Eric Garner are expected to attend the burial. Protests continued throughout the weekend in Elizabeth City, South Carolina. Yeah, that case is wild. So basically, the cop kills a guy. Now, the family, and one of the lawyers apparently gets to see 20 seconds of the video. Now, the judge at that point basically said he's not going to release the video footage to, I believe it was like the various news networks, in addition to the sheriff's office had petitioned for the release of the footage. In North Carolina, apparently, in that area, you needed to have a judge to order the release of the video. They can't just release the video. And so you had the situation where these guys were pushing for the release. The judge decides, look, I'll give the family the copies. I believe there were 6 videos in total. I think there were 5, either 4 or 5 dash cams or 4 or 5 body cams with the dash cam footage. It is unclear what actually happened in this. The prosecutor tried to explain what happened. He wanted to tell the world what happened. But in real terms, if the prosecutor really wanted to tell the world what happened, the prosecutor should shut up and just show the video. The video would be the thing that would give the explanation of what happened. And the catch here is, under normal circumstances, when the police shoot somebody and it's a clean kill, they are throwing the video out. They're putting the video on social media. Anybody that wants to see the video, you got a person standing out here saying, here's the video of what took place, and it's full entirety, an entire 1 hour. The person walks out, says, I'm going to shoot a cop. The cop says, please don't do that. He says, I'm going to do it anyway. The person has a sign up, says, I'm going to shoot a guy. And they kill the guy. And, the cops are cleared. Well, what about this? What about this? If you really want the people to know what happened, you show the video. You don't get out there into the courtroom and try to say, well, he gets into the car and then he backs up and bumps the officer, then the officer starts shooting. Now, the family had an independent analysis, basically, on autopsy, and it basically said that he was shot multiple times in the arm and then one in the back of the head or the back of the neck. That was the one that ends up being the killing shot. But from the standpoint of what took place in the moment, yes, we are being blocked from seeing what took place. And the protests are out there basically pushing for the video to be released. The video is basically, from the standpoint of the public, the objective arbiter. And the objective arbiter is not allowed to give its take. We don't know what happened, though, so there's that. A boat capsized off of we don't know what happened outside of the fact that the guy is dead. A boat capsized off of the coast of San Diego, killing 4 and injuring 24 who were on board. Authorities inspecting the incident said it seems to have been a human smuggling operation. Taiwan has just told its staffing companies to ban all hiring from companies based in China, reportedly in an aim to reduce tech poaching of Taiwanese employees involved in an integrated circuits and semiconductors. Syria's High Constitutional Court selected the current president, Bashar al-Assad, as well as 2 other candidates to run for president in the country. Interesting. Syria's Higher Constitutional Court selected the current president, Bashar al-Assad, as well as 2 other candidates to run for president in the country. So let me get this right. So basically, the president, you got to explain this one, Shane.
Syria's constitutional court, as far as I know, Syria's constitutional court selects presidential candidates to run for the presidency in Syria. There are elections coming up later on this May in Syria, so 26th of May, 2021. That is the brief backstory there.
Very interesting. So
now I was myself curious how that process works, because that seems like that could be subject to some corruption. But I'm not an expert on Syria's electoral politics. So, we can get somebody on to talk about it. That'd be interesting as those roll through.
Yeah,
and this is, of course, while the Syrian war is ongoing, although the Syrian government, the lines of occupation seem to be fairly clearly drawn and not budging much. Although, the fact that the Syrian government is still kicking means that de facto it's winning that war.
Well, the wild part is Bashar al-Assad, they still continued to pay people while they were in the worst of that war. Like, they kept the lights on in a weird way. And I don't mean that in the literal sense. I just mean they still continue to pay their troops and everything else. I guess on some level you had to, otherwise the troops weren't going to show up. But maybe they would have. I mean, at that point you're defending your homeland. It's not just the basic, I'm receiving a paycheck just to receive a paycheck. It's I'm trying to actually protect my home from terrorists. The King of Saudi Arabia has made large changes in his staff, naming a new economic advisor or an economic minister, Faisal al-Ibrahim, and making his eldest son, Prince Sultan bin Salman, a special advisor after removing him as head of the Saudi Space Authority. What? Okay, I'm not even going to go there. The Saudi Space Authority, what experience does he have in space studies?
He was actually the first he was the first Arab astronaut, Prince Sultan bin Salman.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Fair enough.
He flew aboard a space shuttle mission as a payload specialist, and so that's his connection.
Speaking of Saudi Arabia, there was a report that came out that said bin Salman was reaching out, or the Saudi government was reaching out basically to Iran in these kind of secret meetings, and that basically in let's say peace overtures. And then the catch becomes, well, why now? Why now? Why now? Why are you reaching out to these guys now? Now, my framing of international politics is that there is no such thing as world law. That there is, don't get me wrong, there's a policing system where smaller countries that can't defend themselves, yes, you would grab somebody from that. But world law would need fairness. And there is no such thing as fairness in the context. The bigger nations are basically predatory on the other smaller nations. And from the standpoint of whether a nation can be preyed upon or not, it depends on the strength of that nation. If that nation has a capacity to bite, then that nation is much less likely necessarily to be taken, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the nation can't be screwed with or undermined or subverted in order to try to topple the government. Saudi Arabia, I suspect, is doing this only because the United States is now changing its focus out of the Middle East. That it could attack Iran all it wanted to. Now, keep in mind, from the standpoint of the Saudi strength, they have, the sixth strongest military, the sixth most expensive money that they spend on military of all the nations in the world. I believe it's 6. And yet, they can't beat what's supposedly a band of rebels in Yemen. And so, yes, you can starve them. Yes, you can use disease and everything else. But at the end of the day, they haven't been able to win that war. It's been a bloody, bloody campaign that they haven't been able to win, despite the fact that they have all of this money in military. And so it's like, what does this mean in the context of Iran? It looks like you'd get eaten alive if you were trying to go after a peer nation. And you can't even beat what's considered to be a band of rebels. That is nowhere near the money that's being spent on the military. And so the U.S. is leaving. Now, is this a situation where the U.S. was there and Saudi Arabia was perfectly willing to pick on another country since the U.S. was there? And now the U.S. is like, all right, pulling out of Afghanistan. What does this mean for Syria? Is the U.S. also going to pull out of Syria? And if so, what does this mean for Saudi Arabia in that region? I mean, what do you think about this? I suspect that the peace overtures are there because the U.S. is pulling out. And let's say the emphasis that they would have at their disposal has basically just drained away with a pivot to China.
A pivot to China, and that seems to be the brunt of the focus. But of course, it would also be to Russia. It would also be to against Putin in Russia. And so, continuing to maintain some troops on the ground, and certainly funding for the rebel groups in Syria, that would be par for the course for that strategy. And also, of course, continuing to invest in Ukraine, continuing to back up the Ukrainian government to whatever extent we do. So that would fit. Afghanistan seemed like a standalone war. Legacy of George W. Bush, and like a long, drawn-out conflict that wasn't serving a specific sort of strategic purpose in our conflict with either Russia or China. So it wouldn't surprise me if we stay in Syria for a while. That's my take.
Yeah, Afghanistan does feel like a weird standalone war, doesn't it? I mean, despite the fact that it was, the thing that kind of our entry into the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. But they use authorization of military force in Iraq in order to be the justification in Syria. So yeah, Afghanistan felt like it was something different. It's very strange. But look, those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to reach us by phone, or if you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So let's hop across the pond and let's go over to Germany. So where the Federal Constitution Court basically has sided with climate activists against the government. The climate activists won a lawsuit basically forcing the government to bring its, let's say, climate objectives in line in real terms. So the law, and I just read the New York Times, the law under scrutiny in the court case aimed at meeting the Germany's carbon emissions targets under the Paris Agreement and packed by 189 countries to prevent the world's temperatures from rising. The German law included a raft of measures such as $60 billion spending package, a fee system for carbon emissions, and taxes to make flying more expensive. But the law stipulated how reductions should be reached over the coming decade. Decisions on how much to reduce the carbon emissions by 2031 were left open. Now, the issue here is that the court considered this basically kicking the can down the road and the government not really, let's say, living up to its obligations under the law. And so the judge, right here, Germany's highest court, expanded the 2019 law aimed at bringing the country's carbon emissions down to zero or nearly zero by 2050. Yes, the German government put this law. No, the German government was not fulfilling its obligations under the law, and the court basically wrapped them on the knuckles for it. to have a conversation about this and get further into this case. We're joined by Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely.
Yes, green politics
I was going to say, there
in
are
Germany,
a lot of...
that is on the tip of everybody's tongue.
Well, there are a lot of climate activists in the United States that are salivating over this. And, I am very curious about whether or not something like this or a technique can be used like this in the United States. But the more I think about it, probably not. It sounds like there was a specific law for this, and Germany just wasn't living up to the obligations under the law. That's going to be different than in the U.S. Can you explain what took place here? So Angela Merkel basically tied her own hands before leaving office, apparently.
Well, in 2019, the German government approved the law. It was put through Parliament that would cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. All very good, great stuff. The problem is there was nothing in that law of how to do that. What the Constitutional Court, which is roughly the equivalent of the Supreme Court in the United States, said that because there wasn't anything in place to make sure that happened, it was violating the fundamental rights to a humane future for the young people of Germany. So basically, to put this very, very simply, it's a little bit like me saying, I'm going to run a marathon in a year's time, but putting in place no plans whatsoever to train for that marathon, no training regime, no fitness regime, no eating food regime, anything like that, but still expecting that I'll be able to do it. And one of the other big problems with this is that if those limits of 55% by 2030 hadn't been reached, all that was written in this law was well, you're going to have to do better. So they've been told to go away, the German government, to go away, go back to the drawing board, come up with a fit for purpose set of rules, how to lower carbon emissions, whilst at the same time having in place actual ways that you're going to be able to do this. This is quite a big deal how this has come about, because the German government are playing this. They're trying their best to say, yeah, well, we always knew this needed doing, but in reality, they've had a big slap in the face here by the highest court in the land, because they've promised that they'll do this, and it's been taken apart in a legal sense that there was no measures being put in place for them to reach that particular landmark. Now, what you've heard from obviously we got to bear in mind, and we will get to this as well, there's a big election coming up here in September, where the Green Party are very much ramping away in the polls at the moment. So there's a lot of people realizing that there is a green step forward going on, and trying to get on side with that. So you've got the Social Democrats, who are currently in coalition government with the Conservative Union, saying, yeah, well, we always knew that there was problems with this. Don't worry, our plans are we will have a much tougher, beefed up law come the summer that we'll be putting forward, which is, of course, they'll be saying, look at what we've done, vote for us in September. The Green Party have their own plans. Their plans are, well, draconian, some would say necessary. They're talking about huge investment into green energy. You're looking at $600 billion worth of investment into the green economy in the next decade. That is going to require huge tax increases in Germany.
Peter, real quick, what's the consequence? Like, did the judge name a consequence? I mean, I guess it would be contempt of court, I suppose, if they don't fulfill it. But what does it look like to not fulfill it? And what is the consequence that was laid down if they didn't fulfill it?
The overall result of this is they've been told that law you passed back in 2019, yeah, forget about that law. you have to go away and you have to rewrite this and you have to make it proper and fit for purpose, because what you passed through in 2019, it says all of the things it should say, but it has none of the ability to make that happen.
Well, okay, so following up on the consequence conversation, another way to look at this, even though this is being heralded as a victory, I could also see this as a failure in a way, because the government now has to go back to the drawing board, which means that there is currently no law in place mandating it's by 2050 where they're now aiming for net zero carbon emissions. But is there any sign of how long it's going to take for them to draw up those plans? Is there any sort of time limit on that process, Peter?
Well, you've got Olaf Scholz, who's the finance minister, the head of he's running for the chancellor candidates to head up the country in this year's election. He's saying, along with the environment minister, who's also from their same party, that they're going to be able to maybe have something in place by this summer. So you would guess in the next couple of months. This will be a big part of that upcoming campaign. And it's ultimately, you've also seen people like Peter Altmaier, who's a very, very close ally of Chancellor Angela Merkel. He's the economics minister. It's also economics and energy minister here in Germany. He's come out and been one of those big voices saying, "Oh, this was big and meaningful." He described it as epical, for climate protection and the rights of young people, as well as ensuring planning security for the economy. There isn't a plan yet. That's the long and the short of this. I don't think that we were really expecting this to come out. It certainly wasn't on my radar at all that the Constitutional Court was going to be making this ruling when they did last week. It caught a lot of people on the hop, and I would imagine it's caught a lot of those who are running the country, not so much on the hop, but certainly those that were planning an election campaign. They weren't expecting they were going to have to be fighting an election campaign on this. And it is rapidly becoming a major issue, because Germany wants to be seen as not only a world leader, but a leader in Europe when it comes to these type of things, particularly on green energy. They thought they had that law in place that they'd signed back in 2019. They were all patting themselves on the back that they'd done such a good thing. However, yeah, the Constitutional Court have said, well, it's a nice try, but go away and make it better.
Well, and again, to use the analogy, it's like somebody deciding to go on a marathon in a year and coming up with no plan. At this point, it's like they're asking the German public to go on an ultra marathon in 3 years and go and take some time to figure out exactly how you're going to do that. And of course, this being a major issue in the elections coming up in September in Germany, the federal elections, with the Greens potentially coming into a position of either dominance or merely a significant position, in the black-green potential coalition that we're going to see. This is right on point for them. But if the plan is to come up with a plan before the elections, what if the Greens don't like it? Or what? I guess here's where I'm going with this. If the plan is in advance of the elections, wouldn't it be due for revision once the elections are through? And therefore, if there's a package that the government comes up with in advance of the elections, it's going to be a big issue at that point, critically, where certain groups are going to be agreeing with it and defending it. Certain groups are going to be opposing it. I'm guessing if it's not as draconian as you said, a set of policies or plans as the Greens would want, they would be hitting hard on that. Is there any chance that it's going to wait until after the election, or do you think that the plan is to get it through? And if it gets through, and whichever party is in power on the other side, whichever coalition is in power on the other side of the election, if they don't like the plan that's been drafted and submitted and that Germany is now set to follow at that point, what would they do about it? What's the response then, Peter?
They change it. It is highly unlikely that this will be through all of the various things it needs to go through by September's election. It won't happen for a number of reasons. One, the fact that it takes a long time to get things through the system here in Germany. The other one being that people will realize that, why push this through now when you will have, one way or another, a very different looking government in charge of the country come September or whenever a coalition is put together. It may take a little while. It may sometimes takes days, it sometimes takes weeks. It can take months to put together a coalition here in Germany. But yeah, if it's not if the Green Party do find themselves in that box seat, if they find themselves leading the next government, and it's not 70% emissions cuts by 2030, with doubling of carbon taxes by 2023, they're going to change it to that. So that's why they'll end up waiting until after the election.
Would the public be on board for that? I mean, like, this has now become a political issue, like a significant one. The court has just said, look, you guys need to get the emissions down to a certain amount. And that's, this is not a trivial pursuit. We're talking about, like, industry having to change in order to meet these needs. And, even this notion of how they're going to count that, are they going to take off credits, or are they going to say, no, none of this carbon, balancing stuff, it needs to be down this level? Like, how does the court value that? I guess what I'm getting at is, now that this is going to be a part of the election, and this is a real world thing, is the Greens hurt by this? I mean, if the public says, whoa, I was okay with the Greens initially in theory, but I don't want to pay these draconian taxes. Or is the public saying, no, we have to deal with this, with the climate issue? That's something that we need to deal with. Where is the public on this?
Well, the public, according to the poll of polls and the big aggregator that came out just this morning here in Germany, the public are behind the Greens. If you take an aggregate of all of the polls at the moment, the Green Party currently lead by 0.5 percentage point. Some of those polls have them ahead by 3, some by 1. But the aggregate is they are ahead by 0.5 of a percentage point. Now, there's 146 days until the election. I was just looking at my all-important calendar there. We have seen this before in Germany, whereby one party is right up there, and then it gets closer and closer to the day, and people start going, actually, we don't have it that bad. Do we really want change?
Yeah, but the difference is Merkel's leaving. That's the difference.
This is exactly. And the what had been called the Baerbock bounce, once Annalena Baerbock was announced as the Chancellor candidate for the Green Party, that wasn't just built on her name and the Greens putting forward, this is our woman. That's been building for months now, that they had been going step by step by step. So that's where the polls put it at the moment. I think once people start looking at the actual numbers, because we're talking about things like a rise in the highest rate of income tax to 48%, more taxes on those earning over €100,000 a year, wealth taxes on those with assets over €2 million. There will be financial implications.
You speak my language, Peter. Tax the rich, eat the rich. The voice that you guys are listening to is Peter Oliver. He's an EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You can follow Peter on Twitter at PeterG_Oliver_RT and catch us reporting weekly on RT International. We will be back with Peter Oliver in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are continuing the conversation with our guest, Peter Oliver. You can see it as an extension in a way. We're talking about Nord Stream 2 and which political groups, which political figures, which political parties even in Germany are backing it, are opposed to it. and why this does play into, of course, the conversation on climate change. Nord Stream 2, after all, is a gas pipeline, a natural gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. And so I'm sure that calls to oppose it by the Greens, at least some of them, will take up environmentalist rhetoric. And, for better and for worse, we want to get into the conversation about what exactly different groups in Germany think about it and why. We are joined, as we were last segment, by Peter Oliver. He's the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. And you can follow him on Twitter at Peter G. Oliver _RT. Peter, thank you again for being with us. I want to get right back into this conversation and kind of extend it. The CDU-CSU union in Germany broadly seems to be the most Nord Stream 2 positive union, the most pro-pipeline group in the country. The Greens, like you mentioned, which show many signs of rising to power in the federal elections coming up in Germany later on this year in September, are opposed to it. Merkel has, within just the past 2 weeks, I believe it will have been 2 weeks tomorrow, that she just recently defended the move to finish the pipeline. This, of course, comes as she, as well as, Germany in general, have received increasing criticism and more scrutiny by the West, specifically the United States, over planning to finish the pipeline. A lot of pushback against this, and recent conversations around this have sort of revolved around the tensions in Ukraine, which accelerated for a while there and then seemed to be diffused slightly after Russia withdrew its troops from the border there, stopped its military exercises, and again withdrew slightly. So that conversation has faded very slightly. But the pushback against Nord Stream 2, the talk of more sanctions in order to try to prohibitively keep Russia as far away from some sort of strategic or economic integration with the European Union, that continues apace, as far as I can tell. But I want to get into the German politics of this. With Merkel leaving her position later this year, with an unknown figure coming in to fill her seat, who's backing Nord Stream 2 in Germany? Who's opposed to it? What are their public arguments for or against it? Peter, what do you see?
Right. Well, what we know is that Angela Merkel has, for years now, since this has been talked about, this pipeline didn't come about overnight. It's going to be finished very soon, which is why it's come into the news in the last 12 months. It was made a big issue by Donald Trump's administration, and that's been carried over under Joe Biden's tenure in the White House. What we saw under Donald Trump, there was two main issues. It was NATO funding, and it was Nord Stream 2. NATO funding's gone by the wayside, and it's all about Nord Stream 2 when it comes to German and US relations. Now, Angela Merkel was speaking during the recent Council of Europe virtual conference, and she said that, look, the pipeline that's being built right now is an addition to a pipeline that already exists. We already bring Russian gas into Germany through that underwater pipeline. We also bring Russian gas into Germany through existing pipeline networks that flow through Ukraine, also through Turkey, pipelines that go across the Czech Republic and Poland. Basically saying this doesn't change anything. Now, she really has to say that, not only because she's in the big chair when this project's happening or going to be finishing perhaps, but because Angela Merkel made the big energy decisions here in Germany over the last 10 years or so. I think it's even over the last 6 or 7 years or so, to get rid of both nuclear energy and to get rid of coal energy. Now, the coal energy side, not alone around the world trying to do that. The nuclear energy came about post-Fukushima and was questioned by a lot of people we spoke to at the time here, but it's happened. So in order for Germany to fulfill the energy needs of the German industry, it needs gas, it needs energy, it needs something to bridge that gap until renewables can take up the slack. And it sees Russian gas as the most cost-effective way to do this. Of course, that's far too simplistic because it comes into a lot of geopolitical questions, particularly surrounding Ukraine. You mentioned in the last half hour or so that the United States was promising financing to Ukraine. One of the biggest sources of income for Ukraine, around $3 billion a year, comes in the transit fees it receives for allowing Russian gas to go across its territory. Now, if Nord Stream 2 opens and it's 55 billion cubic meters of gas a year that it can transport, that's exactly what goes across Ukraine. There is a chance it could completely cut Ukraine out of Europe's gas transit system and gas transit network. And without those $3 billion a year, well, the Ukrainian economy crumbles because it's already on a knife edge as it is. Doesn't have that money, then we're into real big trouble. So what we've heard from Armin Laschet, who is the Christian Democratic Union Party and the CSU party as well, as candidate to run for chancellor to replace Angela Merkel, is very much him downplaying this situation as well, saying downplaying the concerns of the United States, the concerns of Eastern European countries like Poland that say that the pipeline increases Europe's dependence on gas. He's saying those same lines as what Angela Merkel's saying, look, we're already using Russian gas. We would just be continuing to use Russian gas. But this becomes an issue. You mentioned the Greens. The Green Party almost certainly will play some part in the next government of Germany. Now, they have said outright, they want this project stopped. They want Nord Stream 2 stopped for the fact that they see gas as what it is. It's a fossil fuel. They don't want to be relying too much on fossil fuels. They don't want to be relying on fossil fuels at all. They're also very much opposed to the pipeline for the prospect of doing business with Russia. They have emerged very much as the party that will be set for confrontation with the Kremlin, whatever role they end up taking in the next government, whether it's as a junior partner in a coalition and it would be a big change in policy if they do end up as the chancellor candidate. Now, a few weeks ago, there was talk, because what we did hear from the Greens, they came out and said, they put out already their coalition terms. Their coalition terms that they laid out were, we will not support Nord Stream 2. So that could become a problem for them coming into a coalition with the current Conservative Union.
Well, I mean, Peter, it seems pretty clear at this point that the issue with Nord Stream 2 is Ukraine and Ukraine only. I mean, because it doesn't make sense otherwise. Angela Merkel is making the point of saying, look, we already get gas from Russia. And again, the United States gets a ton of gas from Russia. And so it's like, I get the dependence argument, and then an argument can be made for that, right? It's like, you guys are a NATO nation. NATO is supposed to be there to prevent, Soviets, but whatever, small details. But it's supposed to be there to prevent the specter of Russia from taking over Europe. Okay, but you guys are using gas from the same place that you guys are supposed to be scared of. So I get that part. But it seems that what you said prior makes more sense. That all of the transit fees are basically going to go up in smoke, or the overwhelming majority, which Ukraine, considering it's already a fledgling country, you know what I mean, fledgling, it needs all the money it can get. I mean, even when Joe Biden was talking about the $1 billion, he was like, I told them that they can, he's lying when he says this, because this didn't take place over the course of a day, it took place over several months. But when he makes the point of saying, I said, fire the prosecutor or else you're not going to get the money. Well, he had him, it was by the short and curlies. They're broke in the sense if they don't get it. And the United States wants to continue to use Ukraine as a pivot point. And so it's like, all right, how do we keep them as a pivot point? Does that make sense?
Yes, but the three, real quick, and I want to hand it back to you, Peter, but the $3 billion in transit fees, is that actually enough to let cause the economy of Ukraine to crumble? That's a chunk of change, but from the numbers we're used to here in the United States, that's not that much money. That's not $100 billion. That's not $500 billion. In the context of the Ukrainian economy, how significant is that really?
It's hugely significant. It's hugely significant in terms of the financial sense of it. You're completely right. In national in terms of amounts of money that nations deal with, it isn't that much, but it could be a straw that breaks a camel's back. And it also comes with the way it looks politically, because this has been a trump card that Ukraine has had over Russia for a long time, to say that, like, well, when relations go bad, we cut off your gas, or we don't pay for the gas that comes through. All of these things have happened in the last 10, 15 years. If Russia isn't sending its gas through Ukraine doesn't have that leverage anymore. So it's financial, but it's also in terms of having leverage in the region. It would be a disaster for Ukraine not to have those transit fees. 3 billion isn't a huge amount, but it's a much needed 3 billion. It's also an incredibly symbolic thing and an incredibly a huge piece of Ukrainian leverage in that region. So yes, it would be a massive deal to stop those transit fees.
Good to know. You know what, Peter? I think we're out of time. I think we need to close here. I want to thank you for joining us. Great conversations.
My pleasure.
For those listening, that was the voice of Peter Oliver, the EU correspondent for RT International. He provides daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute talking with Hadi Nasrallah, a journalist, commentator, and researcher on the ground in Syria. We're going to be talking about the lack of COVID supplies in Syria. Reports on this coming out from the Kurdish perspective. We want to hear from all sides. We'll be right back with Hadi on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
You check tab.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about the medical supply situation in Syria. This comes after Human Rights Watch released a report last Tuesday saying that in the northeast portion of Syria, specifically the Kurdish-run region, they're not getting enough medical supplies to prevent and treat COVID. We want to hear about that situation, but we also want to hear about what's being left out of it, which is the Syrian government. Under Bashar al-Assad, what is the COVID response? What problems are they facing? What's the status? And why are we hearing in the West, as far as I can tell, mostly the Kurdish side on this? Why is that coming out, but not the Assad side of these events from Human Rights Watch? Anyway, for this conversation, we are joined by Hadi Nasrallah, journalist, commentator, and researcher on the ground in Syria. He's focused on politics, international relations, and diplomacy. Hadi, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Thank you. I'm great. Thanks.
Thank you for being back with us. All right, as I mentioned, this last week, Human Rights Watch came out with a report saying that, quote, this is not a political question, it's a humanitarian question, end quote. This is the UN Director for Human Rights Watch, Louis Charbonneau. He is saying this about supplies not reaching the northeastern portions of Syria, the northeastern regions of Syria. This is territory that is, last time I checked, under Kurdish control. I'm guessing that this is a nationwide problem. What is the situation on the ground there with Syria? Where is COVID worse? Where is it better? What supplies do they have? What supplies do they lack? I just want to get a general sense. I'm asking different questions. I just want to get a general sense of the situation on the ground when it comes to COVID-19. Hadi, what's going on?
All right. So, of course, the Kurdish area are going to be different than the rebel-held regions or the jihadist-held regions and the government-held regions. I would say that it is difficult for all regions, kind of like the same way, but their responsibility falls differently. For example, when it comes to the government-held regions, because of the crippling sanctions and very, very harsh embargo imposed by the U.S. and their Western allies on Syria, it is very difficult for Syria to find any medical access or any medical equipments that are enough for the Syrian people to actually fight this pandemic. But Syria does have its own local production of oxygen, for example. So that helps a lot. And Syria did donate 75 tons of oxygen to Lebanon, and they actually lifted Lebanon health sanctions the other day, which was collapsing because of the pandemic. So Syria, in the government-held regions, because of its own local productions, despite the sanctions and despite the pressures by a lot of countries and despite the occupations that's been happening north by Turkey and the water theft and the wheat theft and the oil theft also by the US, Syria is actually able to produce its own oxygen, and they're actually trying to now make their own medical equipments and masks just to actually combat this pandemic. So the government-held regions under the President Bashar al-Assad, they're actually doing a bit better than other regions, although other regions should be the responsibility of countries like NATO, countries like Turkey and the US, since they occupy those regions and they fund the militias that are fighting there. So when I hear the news about northeast Syria lacking oxygen or lacking COVID equipments to combat the COVID, I'm actually surprised because this region is basically occupied by the US and the militias there are being backed by the US and the US military is present there. So why aren't they helping? Lebanon was actually lifted by Syria, and Syria did offer to help their people in northwest of the country, but the US is refusing, and their militias, basically their mercenaries are refusing that. So this is the responsibility of the US. I'm not sure why they're not helping them or sending them anything. They're stealing millions of dollars worth of Syrian oil, and they're allowing their Turkish allies to steal the water. And the Euphrates now is like, basically there's a lot of areas that they reported yesterday that are actually completely dry because of what Turkey's doing. They're cutting water off the Syrian people in the north. So when people say this is a disaster, it is, but we need to know who to blame.
Very interesting. So where is Syria getting its vaccines from? I mean, are the sanctions blocking access? I mean, I think that's probably a yes, but from...
Yeah, definitely. The sanctions are actually making things worse for Syria, especially when it comes to the vaccine, but Syria has good allies, and China did offer the first batch of donation to Syria the other day, and they received them, and they're receiving also from their Russian allies. So, and the UAE is actually, which is weird, but they did offer Syria to give them vaccines, and Syria the other day also offered to give a lot of their vaccines to the northern parts of Syria that are occupied by the US military. But I'm not sure we did hear a response from the Kurdish militias there if they won't accept that offer.
Well, and maybe part of what complicates this, and I'd like to get your perspective on it, is that the U.S. had been backing the Kurds, and I'm sure to some extent still are, but we majorly withdrew our support starting around late last year, around October, when Turkey, started a serious offensive against the Kurds in one of a number of these pushes. They've been invading not just northeast Syria, but also parts of Iraq, northern Iraq. That's been going on. If you had to speculate on this, would it be that we slightly, the United States, hold back? We withdrew our support, including medical aid, for the Kurds because we wanted to maintain some distance or independence, some neutrality or something like that from Turkey. How do you see this, Hadi?
Unfortunately, I don't believe at all that the U.S. cares about the Kurds in any way. They don't care about them. They just, if you look at it, it's not a coincidence that the only Kurds that the U.S. is keen on actually supporting are the ones who are around oil fields in Syria. This is the only area where the U.S. holds the biggest positions and the biggest support for the militias there. But the other areas, for example, like Kobani and other northern regions, the U.S. does not want to anger Turkey that much, especially when it comes to Syria. They are their NATO ally. At the end of the day, they're supporting the same groups in Syria. They have the same, I'm not going to say the same agenda in Syria, but they have the same goal to topple the government. So they're not going to anger them that much. So it's like basically give and take. So they tell them, okay, we're going to take the oil regions. You take the northern parts. We're going to allow you to take some few Kurdish areas. You deal with them, and we're going to deal with our regions. So basically, it's like a piece of cake, and they're trying each one trying to take their own share of it. But I don't think that the U.S. cares about the Kurds in a way that, oh, look kind of like they care about Israel, for example. Kurds are just a pressure card. That's all.
Yeah, I love the term pressure card. That's exactly what it is. Which is probably why they don't necessarily care one way or the other about the vaccinations. I thought, I mean, can you explain this to me? There were several groups when the event that Shane was talking about, basically when Donald Trump gave over the Kurds to to Turkey. And from my understanding, there was this, I don't want to call it reunification, but there was the belief that Bashar al-Assad would assert more control over that region. So what has been the mechanics of what's been taking place there since, let's say, Trump pulls out of the region? What has been going on, I guess, between the Syrian government and the Kurdish regions?
There have been talks between some Kurdish groups and the Syrian government because, of course, the Turkish groups are going to fear a Turkish invasion at the end if the U.S. leaves them alone. So they fear a Turkish invasion, and Erdogan is not that, as we've seen before, he's not even going to tolerate any Kurdish militia presence in the region, and he believes actually it's northern Syria, or it's already part of Turkey. So they've been having talks with the Syrian government, and the Syrian government is open to any talks, and it's open to any collaborations and any alliance against any Turkish invasion in the north. So the Kurds saw that as, okay, an opportunity for the future. If something happens, we have Syria on our side, but Syria is not going to always have the same stance if they continue on helping the U.S. stealing Syrian oil. This is actually a bad look for them, and I don't think the U.S. government is going to hold on to their offer at the end of the day if this keeps happening, because Syria is suffering a lot now because of the oil shortage.
And just to give us a brief refresher on what the situation is in Syria now, we've talked about this. Again, the United States has backed the Kurds until late last year when the Turks launched their offensive. What is the status on the ground? How much have the different lines of sort of possession by the different militia groups, whether the U.S.-backed forces, whether they're Kurdish forces, whether they're simple, insurgent forces, or whether it's Turkish occupations of some of these territories, how much have things shifted over the past, say, 7-8 months? Hadi?
There's not been a lot of changes the past 7. I mean, since the pandemic started last year, there's not been a lot of changes in Syria, demographically or military-wise and stuff. There wasn't a lot of movements, but the difference is that the actions of the Turkish occupation and the U.S. occupation in the north has been accelerating. It's like they're taking the opportunity now to take whatever they can and to just destroy whatever they can.
Well, but what does that look like? If the lines of contact aren't shifting, how is that acceleration possible? What kind of acceleration are you talking about?
They're accelerating the theft of the resources of Syria. The water is actually getting dry in the Euphrates River in Syria. Yesterday, we saw a video of someone standing in the middle of the river and it's all dry. And the GPS is telling him that he's in the middle of the river. So
what would that be caused by? Would that be like pumping for agriculture?
That's because Turkey is cutting water of northern Syria to pressure the Kurds. They're literally cutting water.
Are you talking about like damming, or what? How would that work?
Yeah,
I'm trying to get a sense of what you mean.
Basically, that kind of like, damming.
I see. Very interesting. Yeah, we haven't hit that. When we've covered this, we've mostly covered the theft of the wheat and the oil, but water is obviously hugely significant. And so just closing on that, we only have a couple of seconds left here, but desalination plants are expensive. And I'm imagining that for the regions in Western Syria, if the rivers that are coming into their territories are running dry, what are their options and how is that affecting people in the west of the country? Adi?
I mean, that topic we've been talking about now for, I think, around 2 years. That's been happening. And especially the area called Hasaka, that area is literally being
1 minute
water because of Turkey, what Turkey is doing. And I don't see any other solution in the future unless they start working with the Syrian government so it can provide them with all the resources they need.
Interesting. Hadi, Jamarl and I were just talking about it. No, we haven't heard about that as much. That has not come out. And I think we've only had you on once before to talk about this. We should talk about that some other time because that is the stuff of life. We've talked about the wheat. We've talked about the oil theft. That got a lot of press in the West. But water, obviously vital, by definition practically. We need to close this out, though. We're joined by Hadi Nasrallah, He is a journalist, commentator, and researcher on the ground in Syria, focused on politics, international relations, and diplomacy. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show in these disunited states, covering news, events, and politics, and more from across our increasingly divided globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Which means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. If you're just joining us, I hope you had a great weekend. If you've been with us for the full thing, I hope your morning continues to go well. I want to give folks a quick rundown of today's show. From 7:30 to 8 a.m. Eastern this morning, we spoke with Brian McDonald about the Odessa massacre 7 years ago yesterday in Ukraine. This was a massacre that killed nearly 50 people while the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics were in the formation. That sort of cemented the idea that the ongoing revolution in Ukraine at the time was violent and dangerous for ethnic and cultural Russians. We spoke about that. We also spoke about the EEAS, that is the European External Action Service, an office, a ministry within the European Union, basically their diplomatic service. We talked about a report from the EEAS alleging Russian disinfo on the Sputnik V vaccine. We looked exactly at what claims they were making and looked kind of critically, because as far as I can tell, basically the thing here is they're alleging that the Russian government is spreading disinfo, that the Western media is itself spreading a kind of disinfo by trying at every turn to, criticize the Sputnik V vaccine, to paint it negatively, that kind of thing. But if you look around the Western press, we've talked about these headlines over the past, I don't even know how many months, 6 months, something like that.
And by the way, not just the press, Helping Human Services report shows that the goal was to stop quote-unquote malign actors. The Russian Sputnik V. I mean, it's not just the newspapers, right? I mean, there was a concerted effort for this. That's why it's shocking that the EU is like, I can't believe Russia is saying there's an effort to down the Sputnik V vaccine. Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. Strange.
Exactly. No, it is strange. So we went over that. We also briefly talked about Alexei Navalny, whether his organizations are extremist or not. Basically, the argument is they're Western funded. They're funded by outside sources and are aimed in some sense at, spreading civil unrest in the country. We got into that. We also got into who Alexei Navalny exactly is, whether he is a far-right figure or whether he's sort of politically mercenarial, willing to go with whatever, go whichever way the wind is blowing effectively as a political wind vane. We get into that conversation again with Brian McDonald from 7:30 to 8 a.m. Eastern this morning. From 8:15 to 8:45 in the last hour, we spoke with Peter Oliver, first about the German High Court's decision this last week to ask the government to go back to the drawing board when it comes to their plans for lowering carbon emissions in the country of Germany. We then moved to a conversation about Nord Stream 2 and which political figures are backing it in Germany, which political figures and parties oppose it, and why. Interesting back and forth that ended with a brief conversation on Ukraine and how important transit fees are to the Ukrainian economy when it comes to their pipeline, the pipeline, going through Ukraine, delivering Russian natural gas to Europe. We then moved at about 8:45, last segment, to a conversation with Hadi Nasrallah talking about the lack of COVID supplies in northeastern Syria, Bashar al-Assad's government's production of oxygen, using oxygen concentrators in attempts to ramp up mask production, also medical supply production in general. I also got into a conversation on water shortages and sort of planned water cutoff as a kind of stranglehold attempted strategy to get the Syrian government to concede in this long, drawn-out, almost decade-long civil war at this point. Then at 9:15 a.m. Eastern, later on in this hour, we are planning on speaking with Caleb Maupin about regime change in China, plans for regime change in China, as well as some statements recently made by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. I see we have a clip up. We're going to be hearing Lloyd Austin himself on this. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there were at least 29,536 new COVID cases reported in the U.S. yesterday, with 299 new deaths. That number of cases, almost 30,000 cases, just under that, that's the lowest number of reported new cases the U.S. has seen since last September. By the sources I was looking at this morning, that was when cases dropped that low for just a few days. Before that, it would have been early June of 2020, almost a full year ago at this point. This comes as over the past week, there has been an average of 49,266 cases per day, a decrease of 27% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 32% of the American public has been fully vaccinated. That's almost a third of the American public fully vaccinated at this point. And 44% of residents have received at least one dose. Higher than 2/5, close to half of the American public now being at least partially vaccinated. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,448,723 people across the United States, and it has killed about 574,790 people. In the UK, the United Kingdom's Health Secretary Dominic Raab has said that even as the country passes a total of 15 million people vaccinated, fully vaccinated, masks and social distancing policies could remain in place until after the government's Roadmap to Freedom plan ends in mid-June. That's in about a month and a half. Upwards of 41 million vaccines have been distributed in England so far, enough to at least partially vaccinate almost 3/4 of the British public. Health service officials are also reportedly considering whether or not to give a single dose of the Pfizer vaccine to children ages 12 and up as they re-enter school. The UK government is also facing calls to cancel the importation of 5 million vaccines from India. Daily cases in India rose to over 400,000 this weekend. This comes as the head of the world's largest vaccine manufacturer, the Serum Institute of India, has blamed Narendra Modi's government for its failure to procure vaccines for domestic use. His government, this is the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, reportedly waited until late February to order 21 million doses before ordering 110 million doses in March, about 2 months ago at this point, less than that realistically. This would have been well into the current second wave in India. And even if you add those up, 131 million doses between those two orders, that is still not enough to supply more than 10%. It's less than 10% of the Indian population of 1.366 billion, which is what it was the last time I checked. So again, too little, too late. Both of those things apply here. The son of the CEO of that Serum Institute has described being threatened by tycoons in the country who attempt to extract vaccines for their personal use. Vaccine shortages in the country are said to be likely to last until at least July, several months from now. French children are now allowed to return to school as the current coronavirus wave appears to be abating, with people now being allowed to travel more than 10 kilometers from their homes. And that's right, if you weren't following this, for a time they were restricted from traveling more than 10 kilometers from their homes across the country under the orders of Emmanuel Macron. Again, it's an extreme lockdown. I don't know how it compares to China's. It would be good, I'll put it like this, Jamarl. It would be good to do a sort of side-by-side analysis of what China did compared to what we see as the sort of strictest lockdowns. As far as I can tell, different East Asian countries had different ways of handling the coronavirus during its early days. Some were better at tracking, some were better at routine stops, some were better at just imposing draconian, in my opinion, extreme lockdowns, but each in their own way seemed, at least during the early days, to pretty effectively handle the coronavirus. China, the country widely thought now and sort of officially stated to be the origin of the coronavirus, seemed the most severe of all of them. Now, that's the largest country by population in the world, almost 1.4 billion people living there. If they're going to handle it, and including in some of these, extremely densely packed metropolitan areas, they're going to need to do some extreme stuff. But it would be good to do a review of what exactly they did. I just like it. It'd just be interesting to compare it to other countries. Anyway, This all is coming back to Europe. The European Commission has recommended that citizens outside the bloc who have been fully vaccinated should be allowed to travel to Europe without additional restrictions, also calling for restrictions to be eased in relation to countries with lower than average circulation of the coronavirus, basically letting people come in from countries where there isn't much COVID. Back here in the United States, in national political news, Andrew Brown Jr. will be laid to rest today as his family continues to demand the release of the body cam footage from his police killing in its entirety. Andrew Brown was murdered on April 21st, was killed on April 21st, I suppose I should say, by police as part of a drug raid that they had launched at his house. He got into his car, tried to pull into reverse. Apparently, he hit a cop, and the cop shot him. He was shot, in his body, in his head, multiple times. He died, as somebody who's shot in their head usually would do. Members of the families of George Floyd and Eric Garner are expected to attend the burial today. Protests against this killing continued throughout the weekend in Elizabeth City, South Carolina, with people attending, again, saying Black Lives Matter. This is all an extension of the Black Lives Matter movement, of course. A boat capsized off the coast of San Diego, killing 4 and injuring 24 who were on board. Authorities inspecting the incident say it seems to have been a human smuggling operation. In international news, Taiwan has told its staffing companies to ban all hiring from companies based in China, reportedly in an aim to reduce tech poaching of Taiwanese employees involved in integrated circuits and semiconductors. In Syria, Syria's higher constitutional court selected the current president, Bashar al-Assad, as well as 2 other candidates to run for president in the country. Syria's presidential election will be held later this month on May 26th. The King of Saudi Arabia has made large changes in his staff, naming a new economic minister and making his eldest son, Prince Sultan bin Salman, a special advisor after removing him as the head of the Saudi Space Authority. And this is, again, Jamarl justly asked, what business does that do to have being the head of the Saudi Space Authority? Prince Sultan bin Salman was apparently the first Arab astronaut flying to the space station, also the first member of a royal family to fly in space, reportedly. So there's at least some connection there. Anyway, we've got more space news we'll be coming back to in just a few seconds. In Germany, however, police have shut down one of the world's largest networks for sharing images of child abuse. That network was on the dark net. They arrested approximately 4 men in the process. The network had around 400,000 members. And in tech news, China has successfully launched the first module of its new space station, which will require several more modules before it's fully operational. It's planned to be fully operational by the end of 2022. Now, this comes as I want to get into a conversation with you about this, Jamarl, before we go to our break and our next guest, Caleb Maupin. This comes as the International Space Station, I don't know if it's showing its age, but it's certainly old. NASA has said that they expect it to be in operation past 2028. But even then, who knows for how long? That's only 7 years away at this point. And this also comes, of course, as Russia has recently said over the last few weeks, that they are planning on starting their own space station around 2025, when their commitment to the ISS is due to be over. So what you're going to have is a sort of split race, is one way of looking at it. 3 different movements to create orbiting space stations with people on them, with modules to do research and, to figure stuff out about space travel and living in space and how things work in space. All of that happening within the next few years. Let's call it the next decade for a lot of these to come fully to fruition. But China is, again, said to be fully operational by late next year. When we were talking about this earlier this morning at the start of the show, as you went into your monologue, you were saying that you're worried about this kind of competition, what that looks like, and specifically like national ownership of extraterrestrial resources like the moon, for instance, different countries owning different chunks of the moon. I just wanted to come back to that for a minute. What's your concern there? Why are you worried about that?
Like, imagine a situation, and this is cartoonish, admittedly, but the U.S. sends a probe out and it puts a stake in the ground and it says, "We own Mars." Now, it sounds ludicrous when you think about it, but what's to stop it? I mean, ultimately, if you have, let's say, people carving out stakes of the moon, Section B325 owned by China, Section B286 owned by the United States. Like, can you imagine, like, how sad that is? that we take this nonsense of fighting one another off planet. Like I said, we used to have a rule here in the United States that regardless of the animosity that politicians might show each other, the moment that you step out, just as soon as you step off land, all fighting's over with. Meaning the fighting doesn't extend beyond the borders of the country, that there's still this notion of America that goes beyond and supersedes the political infighting that takes place. Well, why shouldn't something like that apply to Earth? The idea that we're leaving this planet as separate entities and countries. Whatever we want to think about an International Space Station, there's something to be said, a level of hopefulness that's associated with all of the countries putting their nonsense to the side and coming together for that. And I feel that's missed if we're breaking up like that. It's sad.
What I think is that Star Trek has thoroughly rubbed off on you. And I don't say that. I don't say that with any spider scorn or anything like that. But it's natural that I guess it's natural to me that we're going to carry our prejudices and our habits and all that stuff with us wherever we go. Just because we leave the planet, I don't think that anything miraculous or sudden is going to change about human nature and the tribalism and the need to compete and all the benefits that brings. Not, it brings detriment too. It brings some negative stuff as well. But we're going to bring that all with us. The killing and the weird building of monuments and all of the strange habits that human beings have, we're going to bring with that. I'm not saying we're going to see ziggurats on the moon. I don't know what we're going to see on the moon or on Mars or any of these planets, assuming we get there. But I don't see us being any less territorial as we go towards this final frontier. Anyway, we need to close this out. We might come back on this later on in the show or at some point soon. Interesting conversation, as always. We are going to be joined on the other side of this short break by Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Caleb on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are talking China, specifically the relationship between China and the United States, as we enter into what appears to be a pitted, and from the United States view, existential race, competition, conflict between the U.S. and China. I'm specifically going to be referencing, this is just as a sort of point of reference. I'm not saying that this is, that this author of this article that I'm about to bring up, that they're representative of the U.S. intel community or anything like that. But I'm sure we're going to see a lot more articles like this. Title of the article, it's over in the Globe and Mail. Title of the article is Regime Change in China is not only possible, it is imperative, quote unquote. Now, this is coming as a special piece, a sort of opinion piece from Roger Garside, who twice served in the British embassy in Beijing, coming, with his perspective from the other side of the Atlantic. But these are the kinds of words I'm sure we will hear at some point soon, and I'm sure are being said all over the place, have been said in back rooms of the National Security Council, of the CIA, of other authorities in the United States government, with the authority and the intent, I'm sure, to try to destabilize China at the highest level by overthrowing its leader. Now, whether this is necessary, whether this is good, what this would look like, I want to get into this conversation with our next guest, Caleb Maupin. He's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. You can follow him, by the way, on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. Caleb, thank you for joining us this morning, and I want to hear your take. Should the United States or the Brits or the international community from this side of NATO, should we try to stage a coup in China? What's your take?
I think that would be very negative. I do not think that would be in our interest at all to try and destabilize China by toppling the Communist Party. And it's quite disturbing to see that put forward as a viewpoint. Could you imagine the reaction if there was a mainstream publication in China that was advocating that China maneuver to violently overthrow the U.S. government. Obviously there would be a lot of outcry, on our end. And that article would be used endlessly to say that China was a threat to our national security. So the fact that this article was circulated in a British publication and so widely discussed, I think is a sign that things are moving in not a good way. We're heading toward this new Cold War many people are talking about, and the potential dangers are very real, especially for Britain. To talk about that publication, let's not forget that the British waged 2 opium wars. The opium wars for the right to impose free trade on China, to flood the Chinese market with opium and basically beat down China's domestic industries and keep China a poor, impoverished country. And that British domination was largely what Mao and the Chinese Communist Party were fighting against, the domination by British corporations that kept China impoverished. And it was, the Chinese Communist Party broke China out of that. It created one strong China, and in doing so, laid the economic basis for the eventual elimination of poverty in so many parts of life, the industrialization of the country. So I think that we need to look at it from that perspective.
Caleb, for the moment, I want you to put yourself in the headspace of somebody to even write an article like that. I mean, think about what we're saying for the moment. A country of 1.3 or 1.4 billion. And he feels perfectly justified, perfectly okay in commanding language to basically make an argument that we should basically destabilize the government of a country because we don't want to deal with the competition associated with that country, meaning the horses out the barn. We don't want to be able to deal with it. We don't know if we can deal with it. We don't know if we can compete in a way where we will win what is considered to be an existential struggle. And so his argument is overthrow the country. What is the headspace for an individual to have to even write that article? And maybe this is a difficult question to answer. But to stand there and that's not even whispered behind closed doors. The guy felt perfectly just and perfectly okay in saying this. He's not worried that the media would attack him for it. He's not worried that the political class would attack him for it. He feels perfectly justified in making this statement and enunciating it aloud to the world. That's astonishing. That's all.
Yeah, I think that the intent is probably not only for a Western audience to stir up the Western audience, to get a Western audience to think that the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party is possible and something we should consider, but I think it was also probably intended to cause domestic problems within China, to create more of an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust among China's leadership. Because there are many people in China that do think that trading with the United States and Britain is something they ought to do. And there are different attitudes toward the Western countries, toward the Western system. We saw at one point in the 1990s the leader of the Chinese Communist Party saying that their goal was to eventually adopt a Western political model. Obviously, that's no longer the feeling. President Xi Jinping is arguing for, maintaining a lot of the unique traditions of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as Confucianism and such. But there is a very, very pro-British, pro-American axis within the Chinese government structure. And putting an article out there that talks about the merits of overthrowing the Chinese government is a way of creating a feeling of distrust within the country and raising the question of who is really loyal and who isn't, and creating an atmosphere where the Chinese Communist Party is internally, having people question each other and creating confusion. And, this was one of the weaknesses of the Soviet Union. At the time the Soviet Union fell, there were very different opinions within the Soviet Communist Party. There was one wing of the Soviet Communist Party that was very, very pro-American and basically didn't believe in communism anymore. And there was what you called the conservative opposition, which were folks that were they were in the Communist Party, but they were arguing. They saw Stalin in a positive light, and a lot of them were even moving beyond Marxism and towards more traditionalist and Orthodox Christian Orthodox nationalist views. But yet, because of the Soviet system, they all just kind of mouthed the party line in public. You thought that the whole government in the Soviet Union all agreed and were all on the same page, but in reality, there were very, very different viewpoints beneath the surface. And China, because it maintains the one-party state, that political model. You don't have the open debate where you know exactly where everyone stands, and that is a weakness of the Cold War really existing socialism model. Now, China has moved toward a more market economy, but they still do maintain a system where you don't have open, straight-up debate between government officials. So, this introducing articles here's the way to introduce paranoia.
And it would. And up until a year ago, I would have reserved that type of criticism for China singularly among world governments, at least on the scale that they're operating on. As a superpower, I would have cast them singly as a kind of culturally and politically authoritarian country, the likes of which we're not familiar with in contemporary history on the world stage, except for the United States, except for the fact that here in the U.S., more than countries in Europe, it seems that out and open, sort of by a weird hidden sleight of hand, political debate, the Overton window is so tightly circumscribed along very specific lines of disagreement and lines of confrontation. Anything outside of it too far to the right is castigated as fascist or alt-right. Anything too far outside of it to the left, some stuff is accepted, but increasingly people are rejected simply as radicals. And certainly in terms of what's politically feasible, debates had in Congress, debates had in the mainstream media or the establishment media here in the United States, it seems like we have so leveled the possibility of a genuine edifice of conversation, the possibility of some ongoing, political, cultural, real dialogue with ourselves. Instead, where it's like we're struck with these culture wars that we've had a brief reprieve from under Biden, but that are still, they show all the signs of being as strong as ever if and when we come back to that level of civil conflict. And as we saw on January 6th, it seems like it can happen at any point, and it seems like we're forever an inch away from that kind of catastrophe, which again seems to me to be the result of exactly that circumscription, of exactly that setting of boundaries in terms of what people are allowed to express, what people are allowed to debate. In other words, the propaganda here in the West does the job of the one-party government as it operates in China. But the other irony, and this is where I want to go here, there's this other weird turn. It seems like as these sort of, as the paragon of capitalism and democracy, what we would thrive on is not only open debate, but also open competition. The whole foundation of capitalism is that you allow for competition, free competition, not mandated by any political authority, free competition between open parties. And yet we seem to turn against that at every turn when it comes to our relationship with China. I want to go briefly. You might have been listening to the last bit of our headlines, whether or not you were. We were talking about the space station and the idea that China is planning on creating their own space station. They just launched their first module within the past few days. They're planning on having that up and fully operational by late 2022. This comes as Russia is also planning on launching its own space station, getting its own version of this in order sometime a little bit later, call it 2025, 2026, when they're talking about doing this after their commitments to the ISS are over. Jamarl, and I'm just curious to hear your take on this. Jamarl and I were just getting into a debate, not even really a debate, but just kind of a short back and forth about whether or not that's good or justified, that kind of competition extending beyond the sphere that we live on into outer space. I believe you're somewhere on the left politically. Could you just, actually, Caleb, could you briefly identify yourself politically? And then how would your political beliefs weigh on that? I believe you're like a Marxist-Leninist or something like this. How does that affect how you view that competition? Caleb.
Sure. Well, I'm a socialist, an anti-imperialist. I come out of the Marxist-Leninist tradition. I consider myself to be a man of the left. And yeah, I think that it would be better if Russia and China and the United States were cooperating in space. If rather than having it be viewed as a space race or a competition, that the countries could work together to achieve their ends. Before John F. Kennedy was killed, he called for the moon mission to be joint, be a joint effort for the Soviet Union and the United States to work together to try and reach the moon. And I mean, imagine how different history could be, if the Soviet Union and the USA had been working together on that moon mission, like Kennedy had idealized in his speech at the UN. And I am all for the space program because especially now, I think the space program is a matter of resources. We talk about, the limited resources on the Earth and the use of different technology and the need to get beyond fossil fuels. And largely what is driving the Chinese space program is their drive for fusion energy. I mean, they recently acquired helium-3 from the moon for the purpose of fusion energy research. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for an international joint effort around fusion energy. And I think that would be a great thing if the United States, Russia, China, India, and other countries were working together to get beyond fossil fuels to develop fusion energy. I think that would be a huge step forward, because the fossil fuels are really just a trap for the human race at this point. We can't keep going the way we're going. In terms of climate change, it's not going to work. In terms of the economy and the global economy and development, it's not going to work. We got to get off of fossil fuels. And I think the answer to getting off of fossil fuels is an answer that largely involves resources and the space program and scientific and technological development. So I'm very pro-space program. I just don't want to see it in a competitive way. I think it would be better if great powers were cooperating.
1,000% agree.
I can agree with that. Jamarl, what's your take?
No, I just said 1,000% agree.
There's stuff I disagree with that too. I think the competition. I think that the space race. I'll put it like this: it didn't seem to get deadly, but it did get men put on the moon, people get put on the moon within just a couple of years of it starting. And I don't know that there would have been that success if there hadn't been an element of rivalry and sort of productive competition in it. And what I'm worried about, of course, is that this is going to turn militaristic, that this is going to be used, that the different space stations are going to be used to, research advanced. This is just one possibility, but as an example, used to research advanced military technologies that we're going to try to use against other countries and that other countries are going to try to use against us. That seems like the kind of thing that we would do. At the same time, though, if we're sort of, spurring each other on using the track and field race mentality that China's defense minister brought up a couple of days ago when he was talking about a competition between the United States and China. If we had that attitude, I could see it going well. We need to close this out. Jamarl's going to bring us back. We're joined by Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Caleb on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So, our Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, basically gave his first big policy speech. And in the speech, he basically made the point that says, if we want peace, prepare for war. Let's play the clip.
But the way that we fight the next major war is going to look very different from the way that we fought the last ones. And we all need to drive toward a new vision of what it means to defend our nation. In this young century, we need to understand faster, decide faster, and act faster. Our new computing power isn't an academic exercise. This is about real-world, real-time advantages. It's about fully grasping a situation moving at the speed of war. Galloping advances in technology mean changes in the work that we do to keep the United States secure across all 5 domains of potential conflict. Not just air and land and sea, but also space and cyberspace.
Let's stop right there.
They mean
He doesn't necessarily announce an enemy, even though there's this clear specter of something there. And the speech, I mean, basically, I want to get into a conversation on whether or not he's right. Is it one of those things that in order to prepare for peace, you must also basically prepare for war? To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Caleb Maupin. He's a writer, speaker, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing political discourse and the geopolitical stage. Now, Caleb, I actually, believe it or not, think he's right. Now, I don't think he's right as an absolute. I think he's right in our current context of the world, because we have this kind of competitive, resource-based mindset where it's this kind of it's a competitive edge, meaning getting land, getting resources, getting your hand on materials, being able to control, being able to dominate. That's our mindset. We could function in a cooperative way, meaning it's nothing to stop humanity in the abstract from functioning in a cooperative way, but in the very specific context of the way we were raised, and the way that we function, in the games that we play, in the movies that we watch, all of those things are oriented towards this issue of dominance, and that's basically what plays out on the geopolitical stage. So from the standpoint of peace and everything else, yeah, on some level in our world, peace is at the barrel of a gun with this ever tightrope of brinksmanship that continuously takes place, where at any horrible moment, something tragic could take place, but by the same token, the strategic balance is the thing that keeps these things in balance of sorts. What are your thoughts? Is that too cynical? Is that too dark of a point of view? But it does seem like to be the prevailing characterization of our world. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm forced to remember a very famous essay by the anarchist Emma Goldman. She wrote an essay called Preparedness, the Road to Universal Slaughter. And it was at a time where these similar arguments were being made in the lead up to World War I. Oh, the United States, we don't want a war, so we need to spend lots and lots of money on building up our military in order to have peace, in order to stay out of World War I. And Emma Goldman was correct in that the preparedness for World War I ultimately led to, the U.S. being involved. And one thing that it must be pointed out is in international rivalries, every move that you consider to be defensive, your opponent on the global stage is going to see as offensive. And every move that your opponent takes that you see as offensive, your opponent themselves sees it as defensive. And this is how international events tend to escalate.
That's
right?
true. Wait, Caleb, I agree with you. That's true on some level. But there is an objective point of view of this stuff. Meaning, if I make a move, I am making that move. This is not a situation where both of us are just balanced. There are times where one country does make a move where, yes, the country may call it defensive, but honest actor looks at that move and says, okay, clearly that country is doing, like, for example, freedom of navigation. Is that a defensive move or is that an offensive move? Objective person looking at that.
Well, in a way, from the perspective of the United States, and this is a lot of the interesting aspects of a lot of this rhetoric we hear around China and around global relations, there is this assumption on the part of our leaders that we dominate the world by default. And if anybody interferes with that, they are being offensive. And, for example, U.S. military presence in the South China Sea, right? They say, look, we're the United States, and by default, we can go everywhere we want. So, why shouldn't we have a huge military presence in the South China Sea? Well, no. China looks at that and they say, well, actually, no, we get a lot of our oil tankers, from the South China Sea. It's the South China Sea. And, our economy is zooming ahead, and we want to make sure the United States doesn't have the ability to cut off our oil supply at some point by blocking the South China Sea. So, they increase their military presence there. And the United States says, wow, look at them. They're being offensive, right? They're challenging our freedom of navigation. Well, it's just kind of assumed that the United States dominates the international maritime routes.
Exactly.
And so China, and that's how this game is played.
But that forces.
If China was setting up a huge military presence in the Gulf of Mexico, I think we would hear loud objections to that. But it's just kind of assumed that the United States dominates the world. You'll notice if there's a U.S.-backed government around the world, they won't call it a pro-U.S. regime. They'll call it an open society.
Right.
It's the Open Society Institute of George Soros, right? It's open. But then if an anti-imperialist or a socialist government comes in, all of a sudden, the country is closed down, right? I mean, this is the way the rhetoric is framed.
Well, I know this rhetoric,
but I think generally people are tired of it. People are tired of the wars. With the war on terrorism, quote unquote, through 9/11, the argument was made, we were attacked on our soil. This is the kind of unprecedented event we hadn't seen since Pearl Harbor. Extremely deadly attack. So there's a justification for us to strike back. Now, whether that justification was actually justified, whether what we did in response to that isn't another matter. And I think a lot of people would think, no, it isn't. No, the wars in Iraq, specifically the war in Iraq, but a lot of people would include our extensive engagement in Afghanistan, which we're still in. Can't put too sharp a point on that. We're still technically in that war. That these things were not justified responses, but at least with that, there was an attack on U.S. soil. There was some sense that we needed to reciprocate and keep this kind of thing from happening again. I don't see anything like that with either China or Russia or Iran, which seem like the two, likeliest candidates for a war within the next decade or so. I don't see anything like that, and so I agree with you for the large part here, Caleb. Not just on the sort of reciprocative escalation between different sides in an abstract sense, but also just if you build up a military and it costs you quite a bit of money, you're going to look for ways to use it. You're not going to just sit back, rest on your laurels, use it as a walking stick. You're going to use the cudgel as a cudgel. You're going to use the long arm that you've created to try to strike whatever you oppose on the international scene. And I think that the other side of this is folks are more tired of that in the United States than ever. If Biden were actually pushing for a war, if he and Lloyd Austin weren't just vaguely signaling that we're ready for conflict and that the situation with China has changed, but if they actually proposed a war with China, I don't see people going for that here in the States.
Well, when it comes to 9/11, I just have to say, that the situation is worse than you portrayed it, because after 9/11, China was fully supportive of the United States. Russia was fully supportive of the United States. Libya was fully supportive of the United States. The countries around the world that we view as anti-imperialist or countries that are geopolitical rivals were totally with the United States because they've been fighting Al-Qaeda type forces for decades, right? And the tragedy of the war on terror is that, all these countries that are our rivals would be happy to fight a real war on terror with us. But instead of fighting a war on terror, the USA maneuvered through, the so-called war on terror in the aftermath of 9/11, not to fight Al-Qaeda, but to first overthrow the Ba'athist Arab socialism, government in Iraq, which is a secular government, and blow Iraq to bits, a country that was, not a place where Al-Qaeda had a safe hold, but now you have all kinds of Wahhabi and ISIS terrorist groups. Libya was a big supporter of the war on terror, even tortured people as part of the rendition program, and was a huge supporter of the war on terror. But Libya has been blown to bits, and now you have Al-Qaeda and ISIS types operating in Libya. And Syria, another, secular anti-imperialist government, has been destabilized, where instead of fighting the terrorists, instead of having a real war on terror, something that China and Russia, I think, would be fully on board, a real war on terror. Russia has dealt with the Chechen Wahhabi, separatists and such. Instead, we've been fighting a war against anti-imperialist states. And at the end of the day, where did these terrorists even come from? Where did Al-Qaeda come from? It was during the Cold War. The United States, backed them to fight the Soviet.
Yes, backing the Mujahideen, exactly. And you said China and Russia. You brought up in Chechnya. Of course, the whole deal with the Uyghurs, the issue in Xinjiang, is their terrorism. That is, as far as I can tell, from the Chinese government's perspective, is the entire reason for what they're doing that the United States is calling a genocide. which, by the way, of course, as we covered on the show before, the National Endowment for Democracy has backed the Uyghurs. Various Western intelligence agencies have backed them, supported the terrorism, it seems. And yet at this point, we're kind of willing to ignore that and only take up one side of the argument. But you brought up Russia with Chechnya. Literally, one of the main things that we're using to hit China right now is part of their pushback against domestic terror.
Yeah. Yes, and the scandal of the war on terror is that that we're not really fighting the terrorists, and that is ultimately the scandal there. And that that it seems like in this drive to dominate the world and beat back emerging anti-imperialist states, terrorism is just considered to be just a side effect we have to deal with. It seems like the Brzezinski strategy of utilizing proxies to attack governments you don't like, it has this blowback effect where you get dangerous Al-Qaeda extremist kind of groups, and it seems like our leaders don't really seem to mind that. Their main goal is this new Cold War, is this drive to beat down their geopolitical rivals, and things like 9/11 they just see as just kind of I guess that's a side effect we all have to deal with, and I don't think the American people see it that way. I think that they want to be safe from terrorism.
I don't think the American people even know that it's blowback. I mean, I don't even think the American people are aware of that. I mean, mainstream media, for the most part, keeps that stuff quiet. Also, this kind of makes my point. There's some perspectives of the world and some framings of the world based on, let's say, governments that put you at odds with other governments. Like, meaning it's not everybody taking a defensive position. There is an objective point of view in regards to the way people or countries behave. If I put a missile platform in space and your country, not wanting to be subjugated, has to do one of two options. It either is going to be very close friends with me, or it's going to put its own missile platform in space. It's not that it wanted to do it. It had to do it as a response to the other country. It's the same thing with, around the world. You have countries that it starts investing all of this money into missiles or weaponry and everything else, but it's doing so as a rebuff, as a balancing, not necessarily as an assertive actor. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. There's some perspectives of the world that force countries to take various positions in either defense or in repudiation just to maintain a certain strategic balance. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to get at here in regards to Austin's speech. It's not so much that I think this is absolute, like in regards to the framing of things. No, the world could take a different point of view that's cooperative, but that's not our point of view. The world is not that way. That's not the language, and that's not the way to which we operate. And because it's not the way to which we operate, one country trying to be a dove when the other countries are sharks, that thing is going to get eaten alive. Does it make sense, Caleb? I wanted to make sure that the point was made in regards to why I was taking the framing. I get that it's an escalation, but sometimes the escalation is impossible to avoid based upon whatever the primary mover is.
Indeed. Well, I think the road to peace is economic cooperation. When countries are trading with each other, they're unlikely to go to war with each other. And that the more that there can be material abundance and prosperity in the world and countries working together economically, the less we're going to see military rivalries divide the world and destroy things. And that's really my hope, is that, what China's doing with the Belt and Road Initiative and kind of building up an alternative form of globalization where countries get stronger by trading with each other, that is really the way out of this. And that the road of destruction and the military-industrial complex, I don't think it's going to get us anywhere as a country.
No, I mean, I disagree. I mean, look, I agree with you that the economic thing is important, but that's assuming that the countries focus on the economic aspect of it. If the countries focus on this notion of dominance, then that's the game space. That's the game to which we're playing. You can't play an economic game when one of the countries is looking at geopolitics, and especially if the country doesn't believe it can win in regards to competing in that economic game of abundance. Doesn't make sense. I just want to be clear. It just seems like there are certain positions that countries take that force and compel other countries to take similar opposing strategic balance positions. And just going with the economics thing.
It sounded like Caleb was saying that we do have a choice, and that if we chose geoeconomics over geopolitics, if we chose mutually productive economic relations over mutually destructive military arrangements, that'd be better for us.
Yes. Okay, right? I could agree with that. But it depends on better.
Is that fair, Caleb?
Yeah, and that would be my viewpoint, yes. And that, and especially a lot of these issues that we deal with in terms of terrorism, in terms of narco gangs, they are rooted in economic problems. I mean, look at what's happening, south of our border. I think that's an economic problem.
Agreed. I can agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can agree with that. It's just not everybody values that economics over the geopolitics. That's all. But no, I can agree with that. I can totally agree with that.
Yeah, we've been trained to view international relations like some kind of zero-sum game where there's winners and losers, and that's a very dangerous way of viewing things. And that, you can talk about the history of geopolitics and a lot of the writing about Atlanticism and the British Empire and the way that they viewed the world through controlling the trade routes. And yeah, it's a very deadly worldview that's going to lead us toward big confrontations. And I would urge us to see things and frame things in a different way. Russia and China aren't going away. We thought in the 1990s, it's the new world order, the Soviet Union, this is the past, the West is going to dominate. Well, it didn't take too long for that situation to be reversed. And Russia and China are going to exist. So I think we ought to figure out how to deal with a world that is multipolar rather than trying to fantasize that somehow unipolarity is going to return.
1,000% agree. The voice that you guys are listening to is Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse on the geopolitical stage. You can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are now in the wrap segment of today's show. We are taking your calls, 202-521-1320. I want to, at some point, if we have the time, I want to come back to the conversation we were just having for just a minute. But we have Tarif calling in from New Orleans, 202-521-1320. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
I have 3 comments. I'm going to try to make them quick as possible. First of all, free Julian Assange. The Arizona audit, and also I think it's somehow connected to Giuliani. I don't want to take it too far because he was the lead person on the voter irregularities, what they was claiming. So if they can prove doubt in Maricopa County, then they can spread it to the circuit court or even the Supreme Court, or maybe not. I'm just saying. I'm just throwing it out there. My second comment: SBA needs to extend the forbearance, the exemptions on paying a loan for another 9 months or something. I didn't know 3 months I didn't have to pay, but I was paying. So if they can extend it, that would be good. And my last comment: when y'all have Yusuf Iram on again, hopefully, I'm definitely gonna call and ask: do Palestinians read the newspapers? And read the Turkish newspapers, read the Middle East Eye, which I think he's affiliated with, to see if they read it. Because I go to stores in New Orleans to get like food from out these Palestinian stores and stuff. If he can, I think all that would help me, especially if they can send out reports saying, "Do you know Tariq Simon?" Then that can help my case. Turkish people that's in the diaspora in the United States and as Palestinians, I need all the help I can. So I'm definitely going to ask Yusuf Iram. I know I'm kind of off in the left field right now, but best I can say. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, Tarif, thanks for the call. I mean, my advice here: I wouldn't try to bring up your personal case with him. If you got a question, I would just ask him what his take is on the issue. I don't want to be too heavy-handed here, but that's if we're in an interview with him, if we're talking about something with him, if we have a dedicated choice of something that we're choosing to talk about, he wouldn't know anything about you. It would derail the conversation. I would just keep on point. That's my thing. Anyway, Tarif, thank you for the call. We're taking more 202-521-1320. Jamarl, we got into this sort of long drawn out conversation with Caleb earlier, and I don't want to extend it. I don't want to make it felt drawn out to me. I don't want to make it more drawn out, but it is a choice. It seemed to me like it's not like we're just dominoes that are lined up to fall as different systems affect us. It's not like the United States is inevitably going to react in a certain way when it sees other countries doing things. We will tend to, certainly. But what felt to me like it was being left out of that conversation is the United States is the country driving this stuff. We're the one that keeps, building up our military expenditures. We're the one that has our troops on other countries' borders and has almost 800 bases around the world. And I don't see how we can defend that as defensive. I don't see how we can plausibly make it clear. I think there's some bad faith going on at the highest levels is what I'm saying. I don't see us. It's not like we're responding, well, they're spending more on their Navy, therefore we've got to spend twice as much to keep them from invading us.
Yeah, that was my point, though. Like there's some countries that the moment that you take this notion of you take an action and it forces the other country to take an action. Like, I put something in space. Okay, what do? Do you stand there and say, okay, we're going to be subjugated by the thing that the person put in space? Or do you put something in space to compete? Well, you put something in space to compete. It drives the behavior. It's not like, regardless of what I want to do, I am still stuck with other countries being there that I'm going to have to respond to. That's the point that I was trying to make to Caleb. That regardless of like what one country may want, like I want to focus on the economy. Great. I want to focus on geopolitics. And for me, you being subjugated is what I need. Like, how do you deal with that in a way that doesn't bring you into a conflict that escalates? It seems like you're forced into the escalation at that point.
But here's the thing. I think that we're the one escalating. I don't think that we've been forced into it.
I agree.
Pushing the other countries to respond to us.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, though. How do the other countries respond to that? Like, because it seems like the other countries are forced to escalate. I don't see how they extricate themselves from that without doing that. That's the one I'm trying to make. For better
or worse, in our own way, we're the one driving stick here. We're the one that's sort of, changing the mode of operations that we're in. We're the one who's pushing the other countries to reciprocate in these other ways. We're the one who spends the most on our military of any country around the world by far. I guess my point is we're the ones sort of determining the pushback. When the other countries respond, sure, they respond, and we can sort of predict, anticipate, and even know how we're going to respond to their responses. But we're the ones who seem to me to be acting very much in bad faith. Or maybe it's just out of an old ideology at this point. Vestiges of the Cold War, that kind of thing, where we see everything as a pitted competition. Maybe the paranoia. I was reading the long telegram from George Kennan, I believe in 1946, in the early days of the Cold War, effectively before it had officially started. And he's describing the paranoia of the Soviet Union. And it's interesting to read him sort of setting the agenda for the United States government approach and the tack that we would take for the next 45 years approximately. And what he saw was paranoia. Now, the response on the part of the United States government was to adopt our own kind of paranoia. You can see this with James Jesus Angleton, head of counterintelligence during some key years in the 70s in the CIA. You can see the paranoia coming out. It seems like we've adopted that as our fundamental mode of operations. We've adopted the attitude that the other country wants to invade us, that this is an ideologically pitted dispute, and that we have to do whatever we possibly can to push back against it. That is on us. And we have a chance, an opportunity, and in my opinion, an obligation to get rid of that mindset at the highest levels. That is on us. And that is a choice that we can take. We don't just have to react mechanically like dominoes falling. I don't even know that we disagree here, but I wanted to make that clear.
No, we don't disagree here. I guess when I was postulating that to Caleb, the reason I was doing it that way is because sometimes people take this perspective that the country or the world can be kumbaya. And yeah, the world can be kumbaya if the world makes a choice to be kumbaya. If the world does not make a choice, then you can have one actor that takes a position that forces the behavior of other countries. That's the point I was trying to make, Tom. And that you can't get out of it by an economic argument. Like a socialist may say, okay, well, if we deal with the economics, everything will be great. No, not so much. Value is not absolute. If one of the countries decide that they want to take a dominance position, then the other country is going to have to either respond as being submissive or conflict. And I don't know how you get out of that. I just don't know how you get out of it.
But I feel like how you get out of it is when that stops working for the country that's doing that. And I feel like we're getting to that point. And you saw Trump, as much as he's a risible, as much as he's as much as we can deride him, as much as we can hate him, the push to pull back 15 engagements. I wish we would see more of that from other kinds of political figures too. Anyway, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We've got to close out today's show. We will be back on tomorrow morning. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you to our callers, our guests. Thank you, Jamarl. Have a great day, folks. See you on the other side.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Give me 1 second. I want to give a shout out to Marcus, Titan Havoc. Pay that babyface chipmunk. And Marcus Will. Thank you. Thank you, guys. All right, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe, share the love. Jamarl is killing it. Thank you, unidentified celebrity. All right, guys, I'm going to end this. You guys are going to see me later today. I'm probably going to get some chess in immediately just as a warm-up. But I'll see you guys in a few. Like, share, and of course, subscribe.